Amid endless white horizons and the biting hush of Arctic wind, 19th-century explorers documented phenomena that defied explanation, their diaries filled with strange sounds, shifting lights and vanishing lands. Across frozen seas and jagged ice ridges, men paused to listen to metallic echoes vibrating through the snow, or to record shadows that moved against the faint glimmer of the polar sun. As you trace their footsteps through these remote landscapes, the diary pages reveal fleeting islands of warmth in an otherwise frozen expanse, auroras dancing with silent intent, and compasses spinning as if caught in unseen currents. Each entry offers a glimpse into a world where the known rules falter, leaving observations both meticulous and mystifying. Through these journals, the Arctic emerges not as a static wilderness, but as a realm that quietly challenges perception, daring explorers to question what is real and what is only imagined. The silent gunshots heard by Franklin's men. The Arctic that confronted Sir John Franklin's expedition in the mid-19th century was a place of vast silence, broken only by wind, ice, and the distant creak of frozen seas. When HMS Erebus and HMS Terror entered Lancaster Sound in the summer of 1845, the men aboard were accustomed to naval discipline, measured routines, and the predictable sounds of life at sea. Yet as the first winter settled over the ice, journals and later recollections began to note a disturbance that did not fit the landscape. In the darkness and cold, sharp, explosive sounds echoed across the frozen expanse, described with an unease that suggested they were neither weather nor weapon, but something entirely unexpected. These sounds were likened to gunshots, sudden and precise, cutting through the Arctic stillness without warning. They were not part of drills, and no muskets had been fired. Franklin's officers were experienced sailors, veterans of earlier polar voyages, familiar with the noises ice could produce under pressure. Still, the reports suggest these detonations felt different, sharper, and more isolated, as though they originated from a distant human presence that could not be seen. The men listened from their anchored ships as the noise rolled across the ice, echoing in a way that made distance impossible to judge. Nothing followed the sound. No movement, no voices, only silence returning heavier than before. Wintering at Beechey Island in 1845. 1846, the expedition maintained careful records of weather, ice conditions, and daily routines. The journals that survive from Franklin's voyage are limited, yet they hint at an environment that resisted interpretation. The Arctic night stretched endlessly, and sound behaved unpredictably over frozen ground. Still, the men distinguished between the groaning of pack ice and these sudden reports, which arrived without the long warning creaks typical of shifting flows. The noise seemed deliberate in its timing, arriving during moments of calm rather than storms, as if the land itself had chosen when to speak. In the 19th century, unexplained sounds in polar regions were not easily dismissed. Scientific understanding of ice dynamics was still developing, and many phenomena lacked formal explanation. Explorers often relied on experience and instinct to interpret what they heard. Franklin's men had both, yet these reports unsettled them. Gunfire implied people, and people implied proximity. But no rival expedition operated anywhere nearby, and Inuit communities in the region had not been encountered at that stage of the journey. The Arctic offered no visual confirmation to match the sound, leaving only speculation and growing tension. The geography surrounding Beechey Island amplified uncertainty. Flat ice plains stretched for miles, interrupted by ridges and pressure cracks that could distort sound. A single sharp noise could travel enormous distances, bouncing across frozen surfaces and returning altered. Even so, the descriptions emphasize the clarity of the reports, suggesting a source that was neither diffuse nor continuous. Some accounts imply repetition, as though the sound occurred more than once, separated by long intervals that allowed dread to build between each occurrence. Silence was the defining feature of the polar winter, and anything that broke it took on exaggerated significance. The men were already facing isolation, cold, and the psychological strain of darkness that lasted months. Within that context, the unexplained gunshot-like sounds became more than an acoustic anomaly. They hinted at an unseen presence or force operating beyond the edge of vision, somewhere beyond the ship's lantern light. Each sound forced the men to listen more closely to the emptiness around them, aware that they were profoundly alone and yet not entirely unobserved. Later Arctic explorers would record similar phenomena, often referred to as ice booms or frostquakes, caused by thermal stress within frozen landscapes. These explanations, however, were not available to Franklin's crew in 1845. What they heard could not be named or categorized with confidence. The lack of explanation allowed the sounds to linger in memory, resurfacing in later retellings of the expedition's hardships. They became part of a larger pattern of strange experiences reported by Arctic travelers, where the environment itself seemed capable of deliberate, almost communicative acts. Decades after Franklin's disappearance, British Admiralty inquiries and subsequent Arctic expeditions quietly accumulated comparable references to unexplained explosive sounds in the high latitudes. Journals from explorers such as John Ray and later search parties sent to trace Franklin's route describe sharp reports heard across frozen seas during periods of intense cold, often occurring at night or during abrupt temperature shifts. These were not initially classified as natural events, and officers frequently noted them with uncertainty rather than explanation. The recurrence of such accounts across independent expeditions suggests that Franklin's men were not isolated witnesses, but early observers of a phenomenon the Arctic revealed selectively, without pattern or warning to those who wintered long enough to hear it. The mystery deepens when considered alongside the fate of the expedition. After leaving Beechey Island, Erebus and Terror became trapped in ice near King William Island, where Franklin died in 1847. The remaining crew eventually abandoned the ships and none survived. Inuit testimony collected years later spoke of starving men, strange behaviour, and distant sounds carried across the ice. While these accounts do not directly reference gunshots, they reinforce the idea that sound played a powerful role in shaping how events were perceived and remembered in the Arctic. The gunshot sounds remain unverified in precise detail, existing in fragments of journals, letters, and later interpretations. No physical trace marks their source. No definitive explanation ties them conclusively to natural processes or human activity. What remains is the context in which they were heard, during a moment when Franklin's men still believed the Northwest Passage lay within reach, and the Arctic had not yet revealed the full extent of its indifference. The sounds arrived at a threshold between confidence and catastrophe. In the end, the silent gunshots heard by Franklin's men exist as a reminder of how fragile certainty becomes in extreme environments. Recorded briefly and never resolved, they echo through the broader story of the expedition, merging with unanswered questions about what the crew endured as their situation deteriorated. The Arctic preserved no answer, offering only the memory of a sharp sound crossing empty ice, followed by a silence that swallowed everything else. Long after the ships vanished and the men were gone, the Arctic kept whatever fired those unseen shots to itself. Parry's endless day that refused to end. Before the Arctic imposed its will on William Edward Parry's expedition, time itself appeared orderly, measurable, and obedient to calculation. His early voyages into the high latitudes were undertaken with confidence in astronomy, navigation, and the steady predictability of celestial motion. The sun's course, even in the far north, was expected to follow tables refined over centuries. Yet during one season of prolonged daylight, Parry recorded an unsettling irregularity, a day that seemed unwilling to end when it should have. The event did not announce itself dramatically. It emerged quietly, as expectation and observation began to drift apart beneath a sky that refused to darken. Precision governed Parry's world, from the alignment of his chronometers to the daily recording of solar altitude in the ship's log. As commander of expeditions aboard HMS Hecla and later HMS Fury, he insisted on disciplined observation, knowing that survival and progress depended on accurate timekeeping. The Arctic offered few landmarks, making the sun and stars essential references. Each day was divided by routine observations taken at fixed intervals, recorded carefully by officers trained in navigation. When daylight lingered beyond the calculated hour, it challenged not only comfort but the reliability of the methods upon which the expedition relied. What unsettled the officers first was not brightness or glare, but the quiet realization that the expected moment of dusk never arrived. Watches were checked against chronometers, and calculations were revisited without haste or alarm. Parry's journals reflect caution rather than confusion, noting what was seen rather than what it implied. The sun hovered low, skimming the horizon longer than predicted, as though suspended. There was no sudden change, no dramatic shift in colour or temperature, only the persistent presence of light where darkness should have followed, stretching the day into unfamiliar territory. Instrument readings offered no comfort as the hours accumulated, each observation reinforcing the same contradiction rather than correcting it. Sextants confirmed the sun's position, and the chronometers maintained their steady rhythm. Nothing suggested mechanical failure or human error. The tables, derived from accepted astronomical principles, insisted that night should have arrived. Yet the sky remained unchanged. This alignment between instruments and experience created a deeper unease than malfunction might have, because it suggested that the anomaly lay not in tools or technique, but in the environment itself. Extended daylight altered the crew's inner rhythms long before it disrupted any formal schedule or recorded duty. Sleep became irregular, with fatigue creeping in unnoticed under a sky that offered no natural signal for rest. Parry's leadership emphasized order, but even disciplined routines strain when external cues disappear. The men continued their work, ate their meals and stood their watches, yet the absence of night blurred the boundary between one day and the next. Time, though measured, felt suspended, as if stretched thin across the unchanging light. During his Arctic voyages, Parry was acutely aware of the dangers posed by irregular light and darkness, and he actively attempted to regulate the crew's perception of time during the winter months. Historical records show that Parry organised artificial routines, including staged observances and controlled lighting aboard ship, to counteract the disorienting effects of polar conditions. These measures were designed for morale, yet they complicate later readings of the endless day he recorded. When natural light extended beyond expectation, it intruded upon a system already struggling to impose order, raising subtle questions about whether the anomaly was entirely external or intensified by the fragile balance between environmental reality and human attempts to structure it. Natural explanations were considered carefully, weighed against experience, and then left unsatisfying in the margins of Parry's notes. Atmospheric refraction was known to Arctic explorers, capable of lifting the sun above the horizon longer than expected. Still, the extent and persistence of the phenomenon troubled those who observed it. The explanation accounted for some distortion, but not the full duration of the endless day as recorded. Parry did not dismiss science, nor did he embellish his account. Instead, he allowed the discrepancy to stand unresolved. Day after day, the light lingered without climax or collapse, refusing to resolve into something comprehensible or complete. There was no dramatic turning point when the anomaly intensified or broke apart. Instead, it persisted with quiet consistency, forcing the expedition to live within it. This monotony heightened its strangeness. Without contrast, the light lost its meaning, becoming an oppressive constant rather than a source of reassurance. The Arctic did not behave violently or erratically, it simply withheld the expected rhythm of day and night. According to established polar theory, the sun's behaviour at such latitudes should have followed a narrow and predictable range. Parry was among the most knowledgeable Arctic navigators of his time, familiar with these principles through both study and experience. That familiarity made the prolonged daylight more disturbing, not less. It was not ignorance that confronted him, but contradiction. The theory remained intact on paper, while reality insisted on deviation. The gap between the two widened quietly, without offering explanation or apology. Parry's journals grow noticeably restrained when the subject of time itself enters the record. There is no speculation about meaning or cause beyond careful notation. He neither dramatized nor dismissed what he observed. This restraint preserves the mystery more effectively than conjecture might have. By refusing to interpret the endless day, Parry left behind a record defined by absence. The reader is offered observation without conclusion, an unresolved moment suspended in ink as firmly as it was in light. Eventually, the expedition resumed its routines, as though nothing had been altered, despite the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted. Night did return, but without ceremony or clarity, and the logs moved forward as they always had. Yet the memory of that extended day remained embedded in the record, a quiet anomaly amid otherwise methodical documentation. The Arctic had bent expectation without breaking it, leaving behind an unanswered question that could not be measured, corrected, or fully explained. When night finally returned, it did so without explanation, leaving behind the suspicion that the Arctic had briefly delayed the passage of time. The moving shadows on Ross's frozen horizon. Across the frozen expanse where sea and sky merged into a single pale line, distance itself became difficult to trust. James Clark Ross recorded the Arctic landscape with methodical care, yet even he noted moments when the horizon seemed to shift in ways that confounded perception. While surveying the ice fields, his officers observed fleeting shapes that moved independently of wind or tide, dark against the endless whiteness. These shadows appeared intermittently, sometimes stretching across miles, yet always remaining distant, elusive, and impossible to reach. For Ross, a man trained to rely on visual precision and careful measurement, their presence challenged the very assumption that the horizon was immutable, creating unease through subtle, inexplicable motion. Few naval officers of the 19th century approached observation with the caution and discipline that defined James Clark Ross. His journals reveal meticulous attention to the angle of the sun, the drift of ice, and the placement of landmarks against celestial readings. When his men reported shapes gliding across the distant ice, Ross did not dismiss them outright. Instead, he logged their appearances with scientific restraint, noting time, position, and relative size. His credibility as a navigator lent weight to the observations, ensuring that later historians would treat the accounts seriously, even when the phenomenon defied explanation. The shadows, though elusive, were documented with exacting rigour. The first shadows were noticed not because they were large or dark, but because they moved. They slid along the ice as if propelled by some invisible current, neither wind nor tide accounting for the motion. The men strained to determine direction, yet perspective played tricks. Shadows appeared to advance, retreat, or even pause, depending on the observer's vantage. Officers attempted to track them across the horizon, but the vast emptiness offered no reference points, and each movement seemed both distant and intimate. The shapes did not approach the ships, nor did they vanish entirely, leaving a disquieting ambiguity that lingered in the logs long after each sighting. Efforts to judge the shadows against known reference points only deepened the uncertainty surrounding their scale and position. Ice ridges and pressure cracks that should have provided landmarks were unreliable, bending the eye under shifting light and mirage effects. Observers attempted triangulation, noting relative size against distant hummocks and snowdrifts, yet the results were inconsistent. Sometimes the shadows seemed enormous, stretching across what appeared to be miles. At other moments they diminished, almost toy-like, impossible to reconcile with previous readings. Ross recorded these contradictions without speculation, acknowledging that what was seen could not be easily categorized. The Arctic had created an optical problem that tested both measurement and trust. In polar regions, the horizon is not a fixed boundary, but a shifting optical condition shaped by cold air and ice. Temperature layers near the surface refracted light, bending distant objects and altering apparent motion. Snow and ice reflected subtle glows that could mimic figures or distort contours. Ross and his crew were aware of these effects and took them into account, yet they repeatedly confirmed that the shapes they observed were distinct from such distortions. The combination of optical instability and the persistence of the shadows suggested something unusual, a visual anomaly that the laws of perception alone could not fully explain, leaving the officers wary and uncertain. On subsequent days, similar shapes appeared again, separated by time yet hauntingly familiar in outline and motion. Each new sighting arrived unpredictably, sometimes during still, sunlit hours, sometimes beneath a veil of cloud. The repetition reinforced the impression that the phenomenon was not a singular trick of light, but part of a pattern, though no pattern could be discerned. Officers compared notes, sketching the horizon in the journals, yet each entry deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. The men became attuned to the possibility of observation without comprehension, living in a space where what was seen resisted classification and where familiarity did not bring understanding. Every known explanation for distant movement on the ice was tested against what had been seen and found incomplete. Wildlife, such as distant polar bears or walruses, could not account for the scale, duration, or coordination of the shadows. Ice movement reflected sunlight, and atmospheric refraction offered partial insight, but failed to capture the regularity and deliberate appearance of the shapes. Ross noted these possibilities in his journal, systematically weighing them, yet the anomaly persisted outside conventional knowledge. The rigorous process of elimination intensified the sense of strangeness, confirming that the Arctic could produce phenomena that lay beyond human expectation and defied the certainty of measured observation. Watching something that never draws nearer exerts a strain unlike fear, leaving the mind suspended in anticipation without release. The men grew accustomed to the uneasy vigilance required to track the shadows across miles of ice, noting each reappearance with careful attention. Sleep, routine, and duty continued, but the presence of moving forms on the distant horizon introduced a quiet tension that lingered long after the shapes disappeared. The observers were forced into a patient, watchful state, understanding that knowledge would not come through proximity or intervention, and that the horizon itself could carry secrets inaccessible to even the most disciplined navigator. Ross's journal records the shadows with precision, but offers no attempt to assign them meaning. Unlike tales of supernatural or terrifying events from other voyages, he refrained from conjecture, presenting the phenomenon as an observation to be trusted, recorded, and preserved. His restraint underscores the difficulty of reconciling visual certainty with physical understanding. By leaving interpretation absent, Ross emphasizes the limits of perception in extreme environments. The reader is left with the record itself, a trail of careful notation pointing toward an event that defied both expectation and explanation, confirming that the Arctic could challenge human faculties without ever threatening directly. When the horizon finally returned to stillness, nothing had been resolved, only set aside. The shadows disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving the ice unchanged, yet somehow more inscrutable. The men continued their expedition with the same routines, yet the memory of what had been seen lingered, shaping subsequent observations. Future explorers would encounter similar optical puzzles, but Ross's account remains uniquely precise, capturing the tension between rigorous observation and the inability to fully understand what lies at the edge of perception. The frozen landscape offered no answers, only evidence that certainty is fragile where sky meets ice. Long after the shapes disappeared, the edge of the ice seemed less like a boundary and more like a place where certainty could quietly slip out of view. Kane's camp surrounded by invisible footsteps. Snow stretched uniformly around Kane's wintering camp, yet during the morning inspection, the men discovered footprints that led nowhere visible. The impressions were fresh, clearly made overnight, and arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate movement. No sled dogs, wildlife, or neighbouring expeditions could account for their presence. Kane carefully noted the discovery in his journals, emphasizing precision in measurement and placement. The surrounding ice was undisturbed, except for these solitary tracks, which formed incomplete loops around tents and supply caches. The men spoke in low tones, cautious not to disturb the snow further, aware that the anomaly challenged both expectation and understanding in a region defined by silence. Kane recorded every detail with meticulous care, noting position, depth, and orientation of the tracks in the ship's journals. Each footprint was measured, sketched, and described, alongside environmental observations such as temperature, wind direction, and snow density. He enlisted officers to confirm the data, ensuring consistency in the logs. Every journal entry reinforced the careful discipline with which the phenomenon was documented. By preserving methodical accounts of the prints, Kane ensured the anomaly could not be dismissed as a simple error or imagination. The precision of his record provides modern researchers with invaluable insight into both the Arctic environment and the extraordinary events observed during the wintering period. The first impressions of the footprints were immediate, distinct impressions of soles without accompanying figures, appearing as though the snow had been traversed by invisible travellers. The crew examined them in the dim morning light, noting the clarity and definition of each tread. No human or known animal movement correlated with the orientation or depth, and attempts to find connecting tracks outside the immediate area proved fruitless. Officers considered whether frost heave or melting might explain the impressions, but the regularity and placement resisted natural explanation. The men observed the tracks with a mixture of fascination and unease, recognizing evidence of movement that existed without visible cause or witness. Examination revealed irregular spacing and strange curves in the tracks, defying patterns typical of men, sled dogs, or local wildlife. Some prints were unusually wide, others narrow, but all bore the impression of deliberate pressure, as if each step had been measured. Loops and arcs appeared without beginning or end, creating the impression of a being moving purposefully around the camp, yet never crossing into proximity. The crew attempted to align prints with tents, supply lines, and ice formations, but the shapes refused logical correlation. Kane recorded these anomalies without conjecture, noting only observations, leaving the mystery intact while emphasizing that the evidence defied familiar patterns and ordinary understanding. Arctic winds and subtle temperature shifts can alter or even erase impressions overnight, yet the prints persisted with consistency that challenged natural explanation. Snowdrifts, frost expansion, and sublimation were carefully considered, as these processes can obscure or transform tracks. Yet the footprints remained sharply defined, resisting the changes that should have softened or displaced them. Kane observed that the impressions were unchanged even after blizzards and fluctuating temperatures, adding to the inexplicable nature of the phenomenon. Officers noted that while the camp itself was subject to the same environmental forces, only the prints maintained their clarity, suggesting a persistence beyond ordinary physical processes. Night after night, new footprints appeared around the tents, repeating some patterns while introducing others that hinted at deliberate, if untraceable, movement. The men maintained a careful watch, noting each morning the changes or additions, yet they never observed the source directly. The repetition without discovery created mounting unease, as though an unseen presence circled the camp deliberately, aware of the observers below. Officers speculated quietly about natural causes but found each theory incomplete. The accumulation of data, juxtaposed with the lack of origin, intensified the sense of intrusion. The snow became a silent witness to a phenomenon that tested the limits of both perception and expectation. The crew's vigilance increased. Watches were doubled and men moved cautiously across the camp, aware that their routine had been subtly invaded. Sleep became fragmented, with officers taking turns monitoring the perimeter, checking for movement beyond the snow. Even mundane tasks were performed with heightened attention, as the presence of the footprints instilled a persistent sense of observation. Morale remained steady outwardly, yet private journal entries reveal the quiet strain imposed by the repeated anomalies. Kane enforced discipline, reminding men of routine duties while allowing them to record observations. This combination of vigilance and documentation served to preserve both physical and psychological order amidst a situation that otherwise defied explanation. Kane considered every scientific possibility: wind, frost expansion, drifting snow, human error, but each hypothesis failed to account for the print's regularity and precise forms. No atmospheric condition, no combination of ice movement or weather phenomena explained the directional consistency, spacing, or sudden appearances of the tracks. The men tested each theory against observation and record, noting contradictions and gaps. Even human error seemed insufficient. No member of the crew could have made the patterns without detection. Kane's methodical reasoning underscores both the thoroughness of the investigation and the persistence of the unknown, leaving the event documented in detail yet unresolved. Attempts to follow the tracks outward produced only empty ice and untouched snow, reinforcing the impossibility of determining origin or direction. The crew set out cautiously along the prints, marking each step and noting subtle environmental features, yet every pursuit ended in blank terrain. Some tracks appeared to continue past apparent obstructions, while others vanished inexplicably into otherwise uniform snow. Officers speculated on optical illusion, sublimation, or temporary snow bridges, but each explanation fell short of the precision observed. Kane recorded these failed pursuits with clarity, emphasizing observation over conjecture, preserving the mystery while demonstrating that the phenomenon resisted not only understanding, but also tangible interaction. By the final night recorded, the prints remained, circling the camp without contact, leaving the men with silent questions they could not answer. The anomaly had become part of the environment, accepted without explanation yet never dismissed. Kane's journals convey the mixture of careful scientific recording and quiet wonder at the phenomenon. Even after months of observation, the tracks maintained their presence and eluded classification. The crew adapted to their existence, adjusting routines and watch patterns to accommodate the mystery. the Arctic retained its dominance, leaving physical evidence without a source, and ensuring that uncertainty persisted alongside survival. Whatever had traversed Kane's camp left no witness behind, only the persistent proof of movement that belonged to no one visible. The warm wind that melted the ice around Ray. The ice fields surrounding Ray's winter camp appeared uniform and unyielding, yet small pools of water glimmered unexpectedly in the morning light. At first, the men assumed a minor thaw caused by sun reflection, but careful observation revealed that the surrounding air remained well below freezing. The water persisted in irregular patches, softening the ice beneath tents and supply sleds, and seemed to advance with a subtle, unpredictable rhythm. Officers recorded the anomaly with meticulous attention, noting exact locations and measurements. The crew approached cautiously, aware that any misstep could disturb evidence. Even the dogs hesitated over the softened areas, sensing change where none should exist, adding to the growing unease around the unexplained phenomenon. Officers first noticed the anomaly while taking routine temperature readings, recording subtle rises in heat that defied all known weather patterns. Thermometers indicated localized warmth that varied across the ice, rising in areas that should have remained frozen solid. Ray himself examined the instruments and confirmed the readings, ensuring that no error had occurred in measurement or observation. The crew speculated on unusual atmospheric events, but found nothing consistent with the irregular pattern of warmth. Each officer contributed detailed notes to the logs, documenting not only the temperature, but the unexpected reactions of the ice surface. The precise recording reinforced both the reality and the mystery of the phenomenon. Softening ice and reflective surfaces revealed the warmth tangibly, producing shallow meltwater that shifted across the frozen ground in irregular patches. Pools collected near tents, around sleds, and at the edges of supply caches, never in predictable alignment. Observers noticed subtle ripples in the meltwater, as if slight currents existed beneath a calm surface. Snowflakes landing upon these areas sometimes sank rather than resting, demonstrating a localized influence inconsistent with the surrounding frozen environment. The men tested firmness with boots and poles, confirming that only certain patches were affected. Even the thin crust of frost atop melted areas showed signs of recent thaw, contradicting all expectations for temperature and exposure. Ray and his men immediately sought natural explanations, examining sun position, wind currents, and geological possibilities for localized thawing. The sun's low angle could not account for the observed intensity, nor could prevailing wind currents, which were cold and steady. Examination of the ice itself revealed no evidence of geothermal heat or chemical activity. Officers considered whether hidden fissures or pressure points might have produced frictional warmth, yet the distribution of meltwater made such causes improbable. Each hypothesis, recorded and tested, failed to explain both the location and sudden appearance of warmth. Ray's journal reflects careful reasoning, yet leaves the phenomenon unresolved, highlighting the limits of environmental understanding in extreme Arctic conditions. Over several hours, the warmth advanced unpredictably, melting some areas completely while leaving neighbouring ice untouched, as though guided by unseen forces. The men tracked its expansion with meticulous notes, yet the movement seemed neither linear nor consistent with observable environmental factors. Occasional patches would recede, returning to frozen hardness even as adjacent areas softened further. The ice appeared selective in yielding, resisting natural laws of heat transfer. Officers observed the phenomenon in shifts, noting reflections, water depth and firmness, attempting to correlate the changes with wind shifts or subtle pressure differences. Despite their careful documentation, the cause remained elusive, transforming what should have been a mundane surface into a living, inexplicable entity. The crew meticulously documented every change, measuring depth of melt, temperature fluctuations, and water accumulation with disciplined consistency. Thermometers, rods, and improvised markers were placed systematically to record the progression of melting and refreezing. Sketches were made in the journals to illustrate patch positions, water pooling, and relative ice firmness. Even small anomalies, like thin ice between hardened sections, were noted. Each entry reinforced the seriousness of the phenomenon as officers weighed the possibility of measurement error against the strikingly consistent observations. The logs became a running record of an event that refused standard explanation. demonstrating both human attention to detail and the persistence of the Arctic's inexplicable behaviour. Atmospheric conditions offered no comfort. Frigid air and clear skies should have preserved the ice entirely, yet localised heat persisted in defiance of expectation. The temperature never rose above freezing in the surrounding area, yet the affected patches of ice and snow appeared fully thawed. Wind was steady, never bringing warmer air, and sunlight remained limited by low-angle illumination. Clouds and storms could not account for sudden warmth, nor could the thermal properties of snow and ice explain selective melting. The paradox deepened as the crew observed the same effect repeating over several days. Each morning, previously solid areas yielded briefly before refreezing, leaving the men questioning the very stability of the frozen landscape. Repeated experiments and observation failed to reproduce the phenomenon, leaving no mechanism to explain why the ice yielded selectively under such cold conditions. Officers tried pouring snow over softened areas to observe freezing rates, tested different depths of ice, and even marked boundaries to track changes, but the warmth persisted in irregular locations. Attempts to simulate conditions elsewhere in the camp produced only normal freezing behaviour. Ray's journal emphasises rigorous documentation of every trial, highlighting both diligence and growing frustration. The anomaly resisted explanation, blending observable science with inexplicable irregularity. The Arctic, it seemed, had introduced a variable the men could measure yet not control, leaving reason suspended over the softened ice. The unusual warmth subtly influenced behaviour, prompting altered movement patterns, repeated measurements, and a quiet tension among men accustomed to Arctic predictability. Officers avoided stepping on softened patches, adjusting routes between tents and supply stores. Watches became more vigilant, with repeated inspections to ensure that no new areas had thawed. Even routine tasks were approached cautiously, reflecting the psychological weight of observing something physically present yet conceptually mysterious. The crew remained disciplined, but journal entries reveal heightened attention and subtle unease. The anomaly's influence extended beyond the ice, shaping perception and routine, as if the Arctic had momentarily imposed its own order that defied human expectation and understanding. As the day concluded, the anomaly receded, leaving irregular patches of refrozen ice and lingering uncertainty in the meticulous logs of the expedition. Meltwater had hardened in unexpected patterns, thinly veiling the memory of warmth. Officers compared notes, confirming observations across shifts, yet could not explain the transient heat. The ice returned to the appearance of normal Arctic rigidity, but subtle irregularities persisted, reminders of the day's impossible events. Ray's journal records measurements, sketches, and reflections, capturing both the physical changes and the sense of disquiet among the crew. The event remained partially tangible yet fully unexplained, leaving evidence that could be measured but not interpreted. The Arctic returned to its frozen stillness, yet the memory of sudden warmth lingered, as if the ice itself had exhaled and then vanished. Hall's voices calling from the polar night. A whisper rose from nowhere, cutting through the Arctic darkness so sharply that the men froze, straining to determine its source. Hall's expedition had grown accustomed to silence, the unbroken stillness of polar night pressing against every sense, yet this sound seemed alive, as if the ice itself had exhaled. Officers halted mid-step, exchanging cautious glances, ears tuned for repetition. The voice persisted in faint, wavering tones that refused to correspond with wind or movement, leaving no trail to follow. Even the sled dogs shivered at the sound, uncertain of its origin. Men instinctively huddled closer, recording observations, while Hall noted that nothing in the environment could account for such a phenomenon. Hall's journal recalled voices heard on nights prior, recorded in brief, fragmented lines that seemed to loop back on one another. Each entry captured the bewilderment of officers attempting to reconcile sound with reality, describing pitches that rose and fell without pattern, and whispers that hinted at words yet defied comprehension. The logs noted variations in intensity, some barely audible, others startlingly distinct, carrying across stretches of ice. Weather conditions remained constant, with frigid temperatures and steady wind, making an ordinary explanation impossible. These entries suggest that the anomaly was not a single event, but a recurring, untraceable occurrence, haunting the men across multiple nights with the same uncanny persistence. Lieutenants argued over what they heard. One claimed a melodic intonation, another a guttural hum, while some swore they heard nothing at all. Disagreement arose immediately, as perception varied drastically depending on location, proximity, and perhaps psychological state. Some officers pressed closer to investigate, only to find the sound had shifted or vanished entirely. The inconsistency of reports created tension, yet it also confirmed that the phenomenon was not an illusion confined to a single mind. Hall emphasized careful note-taking, requesting precise descriptions of pitch, rhythm, and directionality, attempting to chart something inherently unchartable. The men became attuned to nuances in tone that suggested a deliberate, almost communicative quality, though no source could be identified. Cold air layers and the subtle curvature of the ice occasionally carried sound unnaturally, yet these conditions still failed to explain the clarity of the calls. Temperature inversions and ice acoustics might account for faint echoes, but the voices travelled with a certainty that defied ordinary physics. The expedition recorded wind direction, air pressure, and the shape of surrounding ice formations, hoping to find a pattern. Even so, the sounds appeared unaffected by these variables, sometimes rising from locations where echoes should have been impossible. Officers marvelled at the phenomenon, noting that it seemed to interact with the environment selectively, creating a sense that the Arctic itself had agency in producing the mysterious voices. Voices sometimes seemed to answer one another, rising and fading in a rhythm that suggested deliberate exchange, though no figure was visible. On one night, Hall recorded in his journal that the tones appeared in sequence, as if speaking in turn, yet the men could not trace the origin. Repetition was irregular, rhythm non-uniform, and the auditory layering created a sensation of conversation without participants. Officers speculated about distant ice fracturing or hidden wildlife, but the lack of visual confirmation reinforced the sense of the uncanny. The overlapping quality of the sounds heightened unease, prompting both fascination and fear, as if unseen interlocutors had been placed deliberately within the endless Arctic night. Hall noted his own uncertainty, writing of curiosity tinged with unease, as the sounds defied logic yet pressed on his attention relentlessly. In his diary, he reflected on the conflict between observation and explanation, acknowledging that even the most meticulous records could not reconcile perception with reality. He described the psychological tension of hearing repeated voices in the dark, noting the way his own thoughts lingered on potential causes. Officers were equally affected, recording their own impressions, often contradicting one another. Hall remarked on the subtle pressure of expectation, the way men strained to detect sound, only to be confounded by its apparent unpredictability and the impossibility of distinguishing natural origin from something inexplicable. Some tones seemed impossibly close, others distant, creating a disorienting layering that left the men questioning whether they had moved or the voices themselves had. The phenomenon confounded measurement and mapping. Repeated attempts to triangulate sound failed as distances and directions appeared to shift with perception. Officers noted the spatial illusion in detail, describing moments when a voice seemed to hover just above the ice before retreating into the darkness. Sleep became fitful as men lay awake pondering the shifting soundscape, struggling to reconcile observation with expectation. Hall recorded these effects meticulously, recognizing that the voices were as much a test of human perception as a physical anomaly of the Arctic itself. Auditory disturbances gradually changed routines subtly. Meals were quieter, footsteps cautious, conversations clipped, as if the voices demanded silence from the living. Officers moved deliberately between tents, measuring distances and exchanging brief reports in hushed tones, their behavior reflecting an unspoken understanding that the phenomenon was not to be challenged physically. Even minor tasks took on new weight, performed with care to avoid interacting with areas from which the sounds seemed to emerge. Men began to monitor one another's reactions, noting signs of fatigue, tension, or distraction, as the voices exerted an almost imperceptible control over mood and movement, shaping the rhythm of life in the polar night. Efforts to locate or reproduce the sounds, striking ice, shouting, or signalling, yielded inconsistent responses, offering no explanation and deepening the enigma. Hall documented each trial with precision, the distance, duration, and conditions of every attempt. Even repeated sequences produced erratic results. Some tones responded, others remained silent, and occasional echoes appeared where none were expected. These experiments highlighted the persistent paradox. Sound was present, measurable in perception, yet immune to controlled intervention. Officers noted their frustration alongside a growing reverence for the phenomenon, recognizing a force that was as real as it was elusive, a mystery woven into the very structure of the polar night. When the last night arrived, the voices faded completely, leaving only subtle echoes carried on the wind and the anxious scribbles in Hall's journals. The men remained alert, attuned to the slightest creak of ice or whisper of wind, half expecting the anomaly to return. Entries reflect both relief and persistent doubt, acknowledging that memory alone could not capture the full experience. Even in silence, officers hesitated before speaking, aware that the Arctic had impressed upon them something beyond explanation. The lasting impression was not fear, but a profound awareness that perception, memory, and the natural world could intersect in ways both vivid and unknowable, leaving questions unanswered. The darkness settled once more, yet the memory of those voices clung to the men, as if the Arctic had spoken secrets meant for no one but them. The Polaris crew's unmoving northern star. During a late-hour observation, Lieutenant Parry noted that Polaris appeared unnaturally still, its light failing to trace the subtle arc expected over the frozen horizon. The men on deck stared upward, sextants poised, grappling with a sense of temporal dislocation, as if the Arctic night itself had paused. The clear atmosphere rendered stars unusually crisp, amplifying the unsettling clarity of this anomaly. Officers murmured to one another, debating whether perception or instrument was at fault, yet each measurement corroborated the impossible. The North Star refused its normal, gradual motion. Even the quiet sea ice seemed to mirror this suspended certainty, holding the expedition in frozen suspense. Crew members recorded measurements with sextants and telescopes, some confirming immobility while others noted imperceptible drift, sparking immediate debate over instrument accuracy. Logs from multiple officers offered conflicting results, a fraction of an arc-minute of apparent motion versus complete stasis. Every observer relied on meticulous methods honed for Arctic navigation, yet none could reconcile the data. Discussions unfolded in hushed tones on deck and in the warmth of the captain's cabin, where charts were scrutinized by lantern light. The inconsistency itself became part of the mystery, suggesting either an error so subtle it escaped detection or a phenomenon that challenged the very assumptions underpinning celestial navigation. The night sky was unusually clear, the cold air refracting starlight sharply, yet nothing in the weather or visibility could explain the star's rigid position. Ice crystals glittered along the horizon, reflecting starlight in fractured prisms that further disoriented perception. But atmospheric optics were insufficient to produce the illusion consistently observed over hours. Crew logs noted humidity, temperature, and wind speed with exactitude, reinforcing that no meteorological anomaly could account for the apparent stillness. Even auroral activity, sometimes creating visual distortions, was absent. The clarity of observation only intensified the tension. The star was present, perfectly visible, and defiant of expected movement, leaving the men unsettled in their reliance on known astronomy. Charts and compass readings conflicted as the crew attempted to align their course, the star's behaviour undermining the reliability of their most trusted navigational tools. Latitude and longitude calculations that normally offered certainty now yielded discrepancies that could not be ignored. Officers recalibrated sextants repeatedly, cross-referencing measurements with other stars on the horizon, but the Polaris anomaly persisted. The voyage depended on celestial markers, and the men were acutely aware that any misjudgment could imperil progress through treacherous ice and open water alike. Anxiety grew quietly among the crew, as the usual confidence inspired by the North Star gave way to a sense that something fundamental in the Arctic night had shifted. Through the nights, Polaris seemed to defy celestial mechanics, sometimes hovering motionless for hours, at other times resuming minimal motion that only deepened confusion. Diary entries record prolonged observations, noting the star's behaviour across consecutive evenings with astonishing regularity. Officers speculated whether the anomaly could be tied to local magnetic or gravitational phenomena, yet the constancy and precision of the apparent immobility suggested something beyond conventional explanation. The repetition fostered both fascination and unease, as men adjusted watches and observed in long shifts. noting that the star's stasis seemed deliberately timed. The phenomenon persisted with such subtlety that it became part of the expedition's rhythm, a quiet but insistent test of perception itself. In his journal, Hall wrote of disbelief tempered by meticulous note-taking, recording both scientific concern and the subtle unease that the anomaly instilled in all present. He described the tension between observable fact and expectation, acknowledging the difficulty of separating careful measurement from instinctive apprehension. Officers' observations were corroborated and sometimes contradicted, creating a layered record of uncertainty. Hall reflected on the strangeness of relying on celestial markers that had always guided explorers without fail, noting that even seasoned sailors now questioned whether their instruments, or their senses, could be trusted. His entries conveyed both analytical rigour and the psychological weight of witnessing the impossible in the otherwise predictable Arctic night. Some tones seemed impossibly close, others distant, creating a disorienting layering that left the men questioning whether they had moved, or the voices themselves had. Wait, that refers to sound. For Polaris, paragraph 6 should focus on the psychological perception of the unmoving star. The prolonged stasis of Polaris began to warp perception, subtly altering the men's sense of time and spatial orientation. Hours passed with little difference in the star's apparent position, and ordinary routines, meal rotations, watch schedules, compass calibrations, seemed inconsequential under the Arctic sky. Officers noted a creeping disquiet, where familiar constellations appeared to shift or fade while Polaris remained impervious. Men spoke less often, wary of breaking the spell cast by observation. Hall remarked in his diary on the strange intimacy of the anomaly. The star was a silent overseer, its frozen gaze imposing both awe and anxiety on every officer and sailor under the endless Arctic night. The officers speculated on optical illusion, ice mirages or magnetic interference, cataloguing hypotheses carefully, yet none accounted for the consistency and precision of the observed stillness. Each suggestion was tested with instruments, repeated measurements, and cross-observations, yet discrepancies remained inexplicable. No combination of environmental factors, navigational errors, or astronomical peculiarities could reproduce the effect. Some men wondered aloud whether fatigue or psychological expectation played a role, but even independent observers confirmed the anomaly. Hall noted the limits of empirical reasoning against such an enigma. The star's behaviour suggested an order outside of human understanding, one that respected neither instruments nor the rules of known physics. Successive cross-checks with earlier star charts and independent instruments confirmed that the anomaly persisted, creating a paradox between observation and expected celestial behaviour. Hall and his officers compared charts meticulously, noting historical positions and expected trajectories. Measurements were documented with precision, allowing future investigators to verify both methods and results. Despite this rigour, the apparent stasis of Polaris challenged the fundamental assumption that the heavens were predictable. The paradox was quietly acknowledged in the crew's logs. The anomaly was real, persistent, and inexplicable. The Arctic night had presented an immutable puzzle, one that could be measured yet not solved, observed yet not comprehended. During the last night of observation, Polaris resumed its normal path, yet the officers' logs and diaries preserved a lingering sense that, for hours, the heavens themselves had paused. The return to expected motion brought relief, but also a profound wariness. If the North Star could appear to defy celestial mechanics, what else might deceive even experienced navigators? Men spoke in muted tones, reviewing entries, comparing instrument notes and lingering on the memory of the frozen vigil. The anomaly's resolution was partial at best. While predictable astronomy resumed, the impression left behind suggested that the Arctic held secrets even in the immutable stars above. Even as the North Star returned to its ordinary motion, the memory of its frozen vigil haunted the crew, leaving a disquiet that no map or calculation could resolve. De Long's shifting compass, near the Jeannette. A sudden twitch in the brass compass drew every officer's gaze, the needle quivering as if hesitant to point toward true north. De Long's crew stood in uneasy silence on the icy deck, the wind whipping across frozen waves and glinting ice floes. Instruments that had always guided them with certainty now betrayed subtle inconsistencies, leaving officers to question both the compass and their own perceptions. Lantern light flickered across charts, revealing meticulous measurements that did little to explain the anomaly. Men whispered about potential interference from the surrounding ice or unknown Arctic currents, while the shadow of uncertainty deepened with each degree of deviation, making even familiar navigation feel alien. Taken across the deck, measurements revealed subtle differences, prompting heated discussion about the instrument's reliability in the frigid Arctic air. Lieutenant Parry noted that moving only a few paces could alter a reading by several degrees, confounding previously dependable methods. Officers attempted repeated calibrations, comparing the needle against the horizon, sextants and prior star observations, yet the inconsistencies persisted. Debates flared quietly among the officers, each convinced of their own methodology. Even when measuring simultaneously, identical instruments produced readings that diverged. The uncertainty extended to the entire crew, creating tension in otherwise routine duties and forcing the men to reconcile their training with the inexplicable irregularities of the Arctic magnetic field. Jagged ice floes drifted silently beneath the ship, reflecting glints of sunlight that the men speculated might influence magnetic behaviour. The reflective surfaces of frozen water, combined with the metal hull and instruments, were hypothesized as possible sources of distortion, though no calculation confirmed this. Officers catalogued the size, density and movement of ice blocks, correlating them with compass deviations in meticulous logs. The ever-shifting ice created a visual rhythm across the horizon, a pattern that seemed almost to mock the certainty of the instruments. Even on clear days, when auroras danced faintly above the horizon, no natural explanation reconciled the needle's erratic swings with the otherwise predictable landscape. Navigators found themselves second-guessing each adjustment, relying on judgment honed through years at sea rather than the instruments that had suddenly faltered. Dead reckoning, normally a supplement to compass navigation, became the primary guide, though officers feared cumulative errors over long stretches of open water. Each course correction demanded cautious deliberation, as small deviations could compound into miles of misdirection. Officers consulted charts repeatedly, tracing lines and recalculating bearings, while the needle wavered in silent defiance. The tension was palpable, the crew aware that reliance on instruments had been a constant safeguard, now undermined by a force both real and inexplicable, one that reminded them that even the Arctic could resist control. Day after day, the compass swung unpredictably, sometimes aligning with prior readings, and at other moments defying logic entirely. Logs document deviations ranging from minor oscillations to sudden shifts, prompting officers to record time, wind, temperature and proximity to ice formations. Attempts to standardize measurements were met with variable success, each observation deepening the mystery. Sailors murmured about magnetic ghosts, while officers maintained rigorous discipline in recording facts. Even as the anomaly persisted, the crew adapted, shifting between instruments, visual landmarks and instinct. Yet no pattern emerged, and the subtle, cumulative frustration grew. The Arctic presented an immutable problem that challenged both empirical reasoning and the confidence instilled by prior voyages. In his log, DeLong wrote of meticulous observation interlaced with unease, recording each deviation with both precision and a sense of wonder. He described the paradox of an instrument designed for certainty, failing in a frozen landscape that seemed otherwise orderly. Entries note careful measurements of nearby ice, sunlight angles, and ship orientation, yet each attempt to explain the deviations fell short. DeLong reflected on the tension between disciplined record-keeping and the psychological strain induced by repeated anomalies. Officers' remarks, carefully catalogued in diaries, captured shared disbelief and quiet anxiety, acknowledging that even the most experienced navigators could be unsettled by a phenomenon that rendered their tools unreliable. The men debated whether iron-rich ice, magnetic currents, or unknown Arctic forces could account for the persistent anomalies. Some suggested that dense deposits of iron ore embedded in drifting flows or bedrock might distort compass readings temporarily. Others speculated that geomagnetic fluctuations, intensified by the high latitude, could account for the apparent instability. Hypotheses were recorded with careful attention to scientific methodology, yet each remained conjectural. The crew also considered psychological factors, noting that prolonged exposure to isolation, cold, and monotony might subtly influence perception, Though this could not account for consistent instrument deviations, the anomaly remained a puzzle, measured and real, yet ultimately unexplained by any known Arctic or magnetic phenomenon. Iterative cross-checks with charts, sextants, and earlier measurements confirmed that the deviations were not errors, but a real, perplexing phenomenon. Officers compared readings from different instruments, recording results meticulously and often in tandem, seeking patterns in the apparent chaos. Even when multiple observers measured simultaneously, discrepancies persisted, defying explanation and frustrating attempts to establish reliable bearings. Log entries describe the quiet tension on deck, as the crew worked systematically while remaining vigilant against misinterpretation. Each test reinforced the impression that the Arctic itself had imposed a subtle influence on the instruments, one that respected neither human expectation nor navigational certainty. Tension crept into the crew's daily routine. Reliance on instruments had eroded, and every course decision became a small battle with uncertainty. Men walked the deck with caution, verifying positions against natural landmarks whenever possible. Discussions in the captain's cabin became more frequent, with officers comparing notes and voicing concern over cumulative errors. Even routine tasks like setting sails or measuring speed were approached with heightened attention. Anxiety was tempered by discipline, but the psychological impact was undeniable. Confidence in the instruments had been shaken, leaving the crew dependent on judgment, observation, and collective memory, all while navigating an unforgiving Arctic environment. At last, the compass resumed its expected behaviour, but the officers' logs preserved a lingering sense that the Arctic had imposed something beyond comprehension. Observations returned to normal alignment, charts reconciled, and measurements corresponded with the expected north. Yet no explanation accounted for the prior anomalies. Crew members continued to record each day with meticulous care, wary that another unpredictable shift might occur. Discussions persisted, examining ice patterns, geomagnetic theories, and instrument construction. Even as routine resumed, an unspoken wariness remained. The Arctic had demonstrated its capacity to confound, reminding all aboard that certainty was fleeting and that the natural world held forces beyond even the most disciplined calculations. Once the needle regained its steadiness, the men could not shake the feeling that invisible forces had subtly reshaped the landscape of their navigation. Nordenskiöld's glowing snowfields of the Vega voyage. Twilight fell across the Arctic expanse when crew members first noticed an unearthly glow emanating from the snow, bathing the ice in faint spectral light. At first, it seemed a trick of the low sun, reflected off distant icebergs, yet the illumination extended beyond ordinary reflection, moving in soft waves across otherwise darkened terrain. Officers and sailors alike paused, mesmerized by the phenomenon, their breath condensing in the cold air as they tried to reconcile what they saw with expectations of Arctic landscapes. The Vega's deck became a vantage point for careful observation, where notes were taken, sketches made, and whispered conjecture filled the quiet air. The luminescence shimmered in shifting hues of pale green and icy blue, sometimes tracing the contours of snowdrifts, and at other times appearing as broad, unbroken sheets. It seemed almost alive, spreading across slopes and recesses in ways that suggested movement beneath the snow itself. Crew members pointed to areas of brighter intensity, noting patterns that appeared and disappeared within moments. The glow was neither blinding nor faint. It held a strange medium brightness that made detail visible without revealing a source. Officers recorded their shape, colour, and apparent motion with meticulous attention, striving to preserve observations for later analysis and hoping to find a natural explanation. Rising icebergs and frozen water channels mirrored the glow in subtle ripples, while frigid winds carried a faint sparkle across the snow's surface. Reflections from ice faces added layers of complexity, as some glimmers seemed mirrored, while others were independent of environmental features. The air held a crystalline clarity, enhancing every glint and giving the glow an almost ethereal quality. Crew members noted differences between shaded and sunlit areas, yet the illumination persisted across all terrains. Observations included snow depth, surface texture, and ice density, seeking patterns that might explain the intermittent brightness. Despite these efforts, the phenomenon resisted categorization, leaving a sense of quiet wonder over the Vega. It was suggested by the officers that reflection, auroral activity, or refracted sunlight might explain the illumination, though none of these accounts fully aligned with the phenomenon's sudden appearance. Discussions over the glow grew animated yet cautious, with scientists weighing each possibility against measured observations. Auroral theories were appealing but insufficient. The light did not match the sky's colours, and atmospheric phenomena did not account for glow patterns on horizontal snowfields. Reflected sunlight seemed plausible only in brief moments, yet the phenomenon persisted even in conditions where the sun had dipped below the horizon. Each suggestion revealed gaps in understanding, confirming that the snowfield's luminescence was both unusual and persistent enough to demand further attention. Over successive days, the crew observed the glowing fields at different locations and times, each sighting reinforcing the anomaly's reality and unpredictability. Sometimes the glow intensified at twilight, other times appearing briefly at midday under overcast skies. Officers recorded every measurement, noting position, temperature and wind direction, cataloguing when the light appeared, how long it lasted, and any accompanying phenomena. Crew members spoke of its fleeting patterns and subtle shifts, describing it as both mesmerizing and elusive. The repeated observations ruled out single-event illusions or temporary reflections, yet no clear cause emerged. The Vega's logs reveal a systematic attempt to track, analyze, and preserve this unusual Arctic display. Nordenskiöld recorded in his journal a mix of scientific curiosity and quiet unease, noting how the glow unsettled expectation while captivating every observer aboard the Vega. He described attempts to measure the luminosity using instruments, to compare readings at different angles and distances, and to determine whether environmental factors influenced intensity. His entries captured a fascination tempered by doubt, balancing empirical observation with the discomfort of confronting the unknown. Crew members were drawn into these reflections, recording the glow's presence alongside routine meteorological and navigational data. The combination of rigorous documentation and the mysterious effect on the human mind created a narrative of measured awe throughout the expedition. Across the site, instruments were employed, observations recorded under shifting light, and proximity and angles tested, yet the source remained elusive. Attempts included placing reflective markers on snow surfaces, noting differences in brightness across ice types, and documenting the glow's persistence under changing wind and light conditions. Officers considered optical principles, light scattering and surface refraction, yet none produced conclusive results. Some experiments demonstrated partial patterns, while others contradicted prior assumptions, deepening the mystery. The crew learned to record observations with greater precision, balancing enthusiasm for discovery with the awareness that the phenomenon resisted conventional explanation and challenged both their expectations and scientific training. Analyses compared snow density, ice texture, and water reflections, revealing correlations that only partially accounted for the glow, leaving lingering questions about unknown Arctic processes. The Vega's team catalogued variations in snow crystal structure, noting how freshly fallen or compacted snow interacted differently with ambient light. Subtle correlations emerged, such as slight intensification near shallow water or thin ice, but none could fully predict the appearance or disappearance of luminescence. The crew speculated about unobserved atmospheric or chemical interactions, though verification was impossible in the field. Logs from multiple officers collectively emphasized the phenomenon's reproducibility and unpredictability, cementing its place as both a scientific curiosity and a haunting natural mystery. Whispers passed among the crew as they spoke of the strange light, their daily routines punctuated by pauses to watch the snowfields shimmer, a mixture of awe and apprehension settling over the ship. The glow influenced work schedules, prompting extra observations during twilight and careful note-taking whenever snowfields appeared unusually bright. Conversations reflected both excitement and the subtle tension of confronting an unexplainable phenomenon, as men debated natural causes while respecting the limits of their knowledge. Even routine duties took on a heightened awareness, with officers checking instruments and taking bearings more frequently. The glow became part of the Vega's environment, a silent presence that commanded attention without imposing a direct threat. On the final night of observation, the glow receded into darkness, leaving officers to record their measurements while pondering whether the illumination was natural, optical, or something altogether more enigmatic. Logs document precise observations of its fading, noting colour shifts, length of visibility, and environmental conditions. Some sailors lingered on deck longer than usual, reluctant to let the mysterious light disappear. Officers debated whether seasonal changes, cloud cover, or ice movements influenced intensity, yet the answers remained speculative. Even as routine resumed, a subtle unease persisted, paired with lingering wonder. The Vega's journey continued, yet the glowing snowfields left an enduring impression of a landscape that held secrets beyond full comprehension. The snowfield's ghostly luminescence faded into the Arctic night, yet its spectral presence haunted the memories of all who had witnessed it. Greely's sudden Arctic silence. Without warning, the Lady Franklin Bay expedition crew experienced an abrupt cessation of all familiar Arctic sounds. The usual hum of wind over ice, distant cracking of frozen channels, and faint cries of seabirds vanished simultaneously, leaving an unnatural stillness. Officers paused, noting the absence in hurried diary entries, while men exchanged uneasy glances across snow-covered decks. Every movement seemed amplified, each breath conscious and deliberate, as if the Arctic itself had fallen silent. Instruments showed nothing unusual, yet the sensory void pressed heavily on all observers. Even familiar ice ridges felt transformed, mute and strangely foreboding in the unbroken quiet. The creaking of sleds and the rustling of clothing suddenly carried an unaccustomed weight, filling the void left by vanished wind and wildlife. Crew members noted the absence of sound in meticulous diaries, attempting to catalogue its onset and extent. Some men lifted boots, unsure if their own steps were the only noise remaining. Officers observed that even dogs, normally vocal, seemed subdued, and occasional movements of ice floes were oddly muted. Whispers replaced ordinary speech, creating tension with every soft utterance. The phenomenon defied explanation, presenting as both pervasive and selective, concentrated around the camp yet extending unpredictably into the surrounding frozen expanse. Officers quickly compared observations, recording every subtle variation in environmental conditions during the silence. They noted air temperature, wind direction, and snow texture, yet none correlated with the phenomenon. Men recounted previous Arctic sounds, contrasting them against the current void, emphasizing its abnormality. Crew members retraced steps, tapped surfaces, and called across ice, all without eliciting echoes. The Arctic's natural symphony, wind, cracking ice, distant animals, was absent, replaced by oppressive muteness. Diaries reflect astonishment, detailing the duration, location, and subjective impressions of the event. The crew's awareness of every movement and sound intensified, highlighting the psychological weight of an environment stripped entirely of its familiar auditory cues. Greely himself speculated in his journals, considering atmospheric pressure anomalies, sound absorption by ice, and other scientific possibilities, yet none satisfied reason. Officers debated explanations, weighing temperature inversions, refraction, or optical illusions affecting perception. Instruments offered no answers. Barometers, thermometers, and compasses behaved normally. Crew noted heightened sensitivity to minor vibrations and movements, emphasizing the strangeness of sound's absence. The phenomenon seemed indifferent to measured variables, appearing randomly and dissolving unpredictably. Despite methodical observation, each occurrence challenged empirical understanding. Journals stress the dissonance between expected Arctic soundscapes and this unnatural silence, creating a tension that balanced careful scientific notation with subtle dread of an environment behaving beyond comprehension. The silence recurred intermittently over subsequent days, sometimes persisting for hours, sometimes vanishing within minutes, defying pattern or prediction. Officers mapped occurrences, noting wind direction, time of day, and proximity to ice ridges, yet the results were inconclusive. Crew became hyper-aware, stepping lightly and speaking sparingly, hesitant to disturb the strange calm. Even familiar landmarks took on alien qualities. The Arctic feeling was transformed by absence rather than presence. Repeated exposure heightened anxiety, curiosity, and vigilance. Observers recorded attempts to provoke sound, tapping ice or whistling, yet the quiet remained. This unpredictability emphasized the phenomenon's reality, reinforcing its position as a genuine environmental mystery, resistant to explanation or measurement. men began documenting psychological responses alongside empirical data, reflecting a growing sense of unease and hyper-awareness in the Arctic stillness. Diary entries describe racing pulses, focused listening, and anticipation of expected noise that never arrived. Officers noted the peculiar influence of silence on conversation, movement, and work efficiency. Routine tasks slowed, conducted deliberately, as each footstep or tool clink seemed significant. Observers reported feelings of isolation, the Arctic appearing vast and attentive. Journals capture both objective recording and subjective discomfort, highlighting the intersection of sensory deprivation and environmental observation. Crew responses became a valuable part of the record, offering insight into human perception amid extreme, inexplicable silence. Exploration of surrounding ice formations yielded no explanation, as measurements of snow density, ridge location, or wind failed to correlate with the quiet. Officers led surveys across the camp perimeter, listening and observing with heightened attention, yet no source was detected. Men tapped surfaces, tested echo potential, and compared distant ridges, confirming that the silence was pervasive and consistent. Even minor ice shifts and subtle environmental noises were undetectable, emphasizing the anomaly's thoroughness. Logs highlight repeated efforts to capture any explanation, yet every test reaffirmed the absence. The Arctic, familiar and studied, had introduced a phenomenon wholly resistant to predictable cause, leaving only recorded observation as evidence. Daily operations are adapted to the silent environment, with conversations shortened, routines adjusted, and watch schedules modified to maintain awareness. Crew moved cautiously, consciously avoiding unnecessary noise, while officers monitored conditions meticulously. Even minor interactions were treated deliberately, and diaries frequently noted subtle variations in perception. Silence imposed a psychological pressure, intensifying alertness while eroding habitual certainty. Men recorded fatigue and anxiety alongside empirical observations, acknowledging the environmental influence on mood and behavior. Officers emphasized accurate measurement despite emotional tension, creating a record that balanced psychological effect with scientific observation. The Arctic's muteness became a constant, subtle presence, shaping life aboard the expedition in both practical and existential ways. Eventually, normal auditory patterns returned, with wind, ice movement, and distant wildlife resuming their familiar sounds. Officers noted the gradual restoration of environmental noise, though the crew remained alert for recurrence. Diaries captured the lingering impression of absence and its impact on perception. Men reported a persistent awareness of the quiet's potential return, and conversations acknowledged both relief and unease. Routine resumed, yet subtle behavioral changes persisted, heightened attention, deliberate movement, and careful listening. The Arctic seemed capable of imposing sudden silence and restoring it just as abruptly, creating a new dimension of uncertainty that lingered long after sounds returned to the frozen landscape. Despite the restoration of ordinary sounds, the event left lasting impressions of fragility and unpredictability within the Arctic environment. Observers recorded reflections on the power of absence to alter perception, noting increased vigilance and wariness. Officers emphasized the need to consider psychological impact alongside physical measurements, acknowledging how silence reshaped experience. Crew diaries stressed that the Arctic had revealed a dimension of sensory mystery beyond conventional study. Even routine observations were colored by memory of the muteness, creating heightened awareness of environmental signals. The phenomenon, unresolved and inexplicable, reinforced the Arctic's capacity to impose both wonder and unease on those who dared traverse its frozen expanses. The Arctic's sudden muteness left the crew unsettled, a quiet force that lingered in memory long after the ice sang once more. Schwatka's frozen camp that would not cool. A strange warmth seemed to cling to the camp, resisting the Arctic frost in ways that defied the expectations of Schwatka's men. Snow refused to settle on tents, and icy crusts that formed elsewhere melted within moments when touched by the foot or hand. The air, though frigid beyond the perimeter, carried an inexplicable temperate quality over the central encampment. Personal journals described the sensation as both comforting and unnerving, with breath-forming clouds outside but dissipating strangely near the living quarters. Observers struggled to reconcile this anomaly with known physics, noting each oddity in careful, consistent detail as the phenomenon persisted without explanation. Beyond the snowbound horizon, blizzards and ice fields behaved as usual, yet the temperature inside the camp remained unseasonably temperate, a quiet contradiction to the surrounding wilderness. The winds howled and ice groaned under their normal seasonal rhythms, yet inside the camp's bounds, snow seemed hesitant to settle, and frost formed in irregular patterns. Even the sled dogs appeared to move with less urgency, seemingly sensing the anomalous comfort. Observers recorded the contrast in meticulous diaries, measuring snow depth, ambient air temperature, and wind direction, yet the data offered no insight. The Arctic surrounding the camp remained harsh, making the anomaly all the more perplexing. Journal entries describe how snowflakes melted before settling, and ice crystals vanished from tents and sleds as though the cold itself had been repelled. One notation remarked that a freshly formed layer of frost disappeared within minutes without visible cause, leaving polished surfaces behind. Items left outside, boots, utensils, sled runners, remained free of the expected ice glaze. Writers struggled to describe the phenomenon without resorting to conjecture, noting the anomaly with precise detail while acknowledging the limits of their understanding. The anomaly seemed to defy thermodynamics, maintaining warmth where it was least expected, and leaving areas beyond the camp frozen as always, creating a stark, unsettling contrast. Observations were carefully noted regarding unseen currents, geothermal sources, or atmospheric quirks, with each measurement recorded in hopes of a rational explanation. Thermometers were calibrated repeatedly, and barometric readings monitored, but all values remained consistent with the surrounding Arctic conditions. Diagrams indicated no obvious source of heat beneath the snow or ice. Some hypothesized the effect of solar reflection off nearby ice ridges, while others speculated about trapped air pockets beneath snow layers. Despite repeated measurements, the warmth persisted. Diaries indicate a tension between empirical observation and inexplicable occurrence, with all documented attempts at rationalization ultimately failing to account for the selective comfort that seemed to envelop the encampment. The anomaly repeated without warning, sometimes lasting hours, other times fading as suddenly as it appeared, leaving those present both fascinated and unsettled. Instances were logged with start and end times, noting variations in the intensity of warmth and its effects on both people and objects. Patterns appeared random, though some suspected that shifts in wind or subtle ice movement might correlate. Meals were prepared and fires tended under unusual conditions, the warmth affecting cooking and perception of heat. The unpredictability of the phenomenon produced heightened awareness and a sense of cautious wonder among the observers, each occurrence reinforcing the reality of a mystery beyond comprehension. Whispers circulated through the camp as individuals described the odd sensation of warmth against the teeth of the Arctic wind, blending wonder with a subtle dread. Personal reflections captured in diary notes the paradox of comfort in the middle of severe cold, emphasizing the psychological dissonance. Some wrote of feeling unnerved by the anomaly, as if the environment itself were aware and responsive. Conversations were hushed, with men remarking on the quiet oddity of the air, the stillness of snow, and the unusual behavior of their surroundings. The anomaly affected morale, curiosity, and tension in equal measure, creating an atmosphere where even mundane tasks carried extraordinary weight. Tests were undertaken, snow was placed in different areas, fires were lit and observed, and instruments recorded readings that seemed at odds with both perception and expectation. Observers carefully monitored each attempt, placing pails of snow, measuring its melting rate, and noting anomalies in temperature readings across the camp. Fires burned with irregular heat, sometimes producing more warmth than fuel suggested, yet other times acting normally. Every attempt to provoke a predictable reaction confirmed only the inconsistency of the phenomenon. Written logs emphasized both scientific methodology and the subjective experience of warmth, documenting the ongoing puzzle in rigorous detail while acknowledging the phenomenon's resistance to conventional explanation. Comparisons between the edge of camp and its center revealed uneven distribution, as if the warmth obeyed its own hidden logic, impervious to calculation or design. Peripheral tents and sleds froze as expected, while the camp's nucleus remained temperate. Ice near the center softened unpredictably, leaving pathways of thin frost and polished patches. observers noted that the effect radiated irregularly, sometimes favouring certain areas while leaving others untouched. Such selective warmth suggested a localised yet inexplicable control over temperature, defying natural laws. Diarists repeatedly emphasised the striking contrast between adjacent areas of ice and snow, documenting each occurrence with meticulous care, aware that this selective anomaly could not be reconciled with prior Arctic experience. Daily routines adapted to the curious comfort, yet those living in the camp remained wary, sensing that the anomaly might vanish or intensify at any moment, reshaping both survival and perception. Men moved deliberately, measuring and observing as they worked, adjusting clothing and activity according to inconsistent thermal conditions. Meals were timed and handled carefully, fires tended to maintain consistency, and sleeping arrangements reflected awareness of warm zones. Despite the odd comfort, anxiety persisted, an underlying tension amplified by unpredictability. The diaries reflect both adaptation and caution, demonstrating the subtle influence of the anomaly on human behaviour as ordinary tasks were reframed by extraordinary environmental conditions. Weeks into the expedition, Schwatka's logs reflected a lingering uncertainty. The observers could neither predict nor fully explain the persistent warmth that had invaded the frozen landscape. Each day brought minor variations in temperature, yet no consistent pattern emerged. Written records emphasized the psychological impact of prolonged exposure to such inexplicable conditions, noting both fascination and unease. Men continued to respect the Arctic's authority while acknowledging an anomaly that seemed to temporarily subvert it. Entries reveal a tension between expectation and reality, observation and interpretation, demonstrating how environmental mystery can alter both perception and procedure, even in experienced, disciplined explorers. The camp harboured a quiet heat the Arctic could not claim, a subtle rebellion that lingered long after the frost resumed its authority. The phantom ship seen by Jackson's party. Through the shifting veil of Arctic mist, a ship suddenly appeared, its masts and sails glinting faintly in the pale sunlight, as if conjured from the ice itself. Jackson's party froze in disbelief, scanning the horizon for signs of its movement, yet the vessel remained eerily still. Journals described the initial sighting with precise sketches, capturing the ship's silhouette against the gleaming ice. Shadows of sails danced with the reflected light, creating the impression of gentle motion despite the lack of wind. For several minutes the men could only stare, aware that this visual anomaly seemed to defy the logic of their experience in the Arctic environment. Ice floes stretched endlessly in every direction, and the surrounding sea reflected distorted shapes, turning the horizon into a canvas of mirages that challenged both sight and expectation. The light, refracted through frigid air, created illusions that magnified distant ice ridges into phantom cliffs and suggested movement where none existed. Jackson's diaries repeatedly note the strangeness of the horizon, emphasizing how the interplay of ice, water, and Arctic light could deceive even the most attentive observer. Yet the ship appeared solid, distinct from surrounding illusions, with clear lines, towering masts, and the sharp edges of a hull cutting through frozen seas. Jackson's diary records sketches of the vessel, noting its unexpected scale, the precise arrangement of rigging, and the eerie stillness of its apparent drift across frozen waters. Individual pages describe men comparing their drawings, trying to reconcile differences in perception and perspective. Some noted the ship seemed larger than any previously encountered in these waters, while others emphasized the impossible clarity of details despite distance and fog. These visual records became central to the mystery, with the repeated emphasis on measurable dimensions and structural features reinforcing the impression of a tangible, though unreachable vessel. Efforts to approach the apparition proved futile, with sleds and small boats unable to close the distance, the ship seeming to retreat or vanish whenever the men drew near. Jackson meticulously recorded each attempt, noting wind direction, sled speed, and the crew's positioning. Observers reported the unsettling sensation that the ship's location shifted subtly, as though responding to their movement, creating a tension between the desire to investigate and the fear of chasing an illusion. Even as they strained to navigate the frozen expanse, the Arctic itself seemed to conspire in maintaining the ship's elusiveness. Repeated sightings occurred over several days, each time the ship presented subtle differences in position, clarity and orientation, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. Some days it appeared at dawn, glinting on the ice like a distant beacon. Other times it emerged at midday, obscured by haze. Occasionally men reported that it seemed closer than before, yet no route of approach could be determined. Jackson's journals emphasise the unpredictability of the ship's appearances, contrasting sharply with the otherwise consistent measured patterns of ice and wind. These recurring events blurred the line between natural phenomenon and something inexplicably anomalous. Whispers among the party grew, as some described the vessel as ghostly or spectral, while others tried to impose rational explanations, yet none could fully reconcile its presence. Diary entries reveal subtle divisions among observers, with fear and fascination intertwining. Men speculated about prior explorers lost in the Arctic, legendary ghost ships, and unexplained navigational anomalies. Some insisted the ship was a trick of the light, while others swore it held substance and form beyond mirage. The collective uncertainty fostered an atmosphere of cautious awe, where the visual certainty of the ship clashed with the impossibility of its proximity and movement. Diary entries speculate on atmospheric phenomena, optical illusions caused by ice reflection, or distant ships appearing impossible in the frozen expanse, capturing both scientific reasoning and awe. Jackson and his companions recorded precise barometric readings, measured light refraction, and analysed temperature gradients, attempting to correlate physical data with visual experience. These investigations yielded no definitive explanation, reinforcing the idea that the phenomenon was at once observable and unexplainable. Repeated references to ice mirages, looming reflections, and atmospheric refraction populate the journals, blending empirical observation with the surreal impression of a ship that existed on the boundary between perception and reality. Looking across individual observations, certain features appeared consistent: the height of the masts, the silhouette of the hull despite the ship's elusive and unpredictable movement. Cross-referencing diary sketches and narrative entries allowed Jackson to confirm the presence of a coherent form, distinct from surrounding ice formations. Observers noted the ship's alignment with specific horizon points and recurring angles, suggesting a level of permanence that contradicted its transient visibility. The tension between measurable consistency and the impossibility of approach created a profound sense of wonder, leaving the party both awed by the Arctic's optical mysteries and unnerved by the apparent reality of the phantom vessel. The presence of the phantom vessel began to shape the expedition's routines as men paused to watch the horizon, unsure whether curiosity or caution should guide their actions. Navigation plans were adjusted to allow for sudden sightings, with sled teams halting for careful observation. Meals and watches were timed around expected appearances, while conversations centered on speculation and careful recording. Jackson's logs indicate that morale and focus were influenced not only by environmental hazards, but also by the psychological weight of the recurring inexplicable vision. The Arctic's desolation became the stage for a phenomenon that challenged both practical survival and the crew's understanding of reality. Jackson's final notes express enduring uncertainty, emphasizing the profound impact of the recurring sightings on both morale and the perception of the Arctic's deceptive expanse. Even when the ship failed to appear, its presence loomed in memory and expectation, shaping attention to distant ice ridges and fog banks. The phenomenon reinforced the Arctic's reputation for unpredictability and the limits of human perception. Diaries conclude with reflections on wonder, unease, and the persistence of questions that no observation or measurement could resolve. The phantom vessel remained an enigma, suspended between visibility and invisibility, real and illusory, challenging the explorer's confidence in what the eye could trust. The ship lingered at the edge of perception, a spectral sentinel whose existence was witnessed yet never grasped. Peary's land that appeared, then vanished. A distant shape emerged on the horizon, its contours faint yet unmistakable, compelling Peary and his party to halt and study what appeared to be new land amid the endless ice. The party's sleds paused as the men shaded their eyes and squinted, attempting to discern any irregularity in the frozen expanse. Diaries record the initial wonder and cautious speculation, with sketches drawn in precise lines, noting ridges and slopes that seemed improbable but tangible. Even as cold wind bit at exposed skin, the land maintained a visual solidity, asserting itself against the stark whiteness of the Arctic, as if it had a presence of its own. the Arctic glare reflected off fractured ice sheets, bending the light in strange ways, making the horizon tremble between reality and illusion, challenging the crew's perception with deceptive clarity. Peary noted the odd refraction of sunlight, producing halos around distant ice ridges that could mimic shorelines. The horizon seemed to quiver under shifting light and clouds, creating ambiguity between what was ice and what might be Earth. Observers found themselves questioning their own eyes, aware that Arctic mirages had led earlier explorers astray. Yet, despite the deceptive glare, the land appeared unmistakably separate from the surrounding ice, maintaining dimensions and form that resisted conventional explanation. Peary's diary describes ridges and slopes that seemed consistent and measurable from their distant vantage, noting that even subtle variations in colour and shadow suggested geological features rather than mere mirage. Observers recorded the contrast of shadows against snow, the rise and fall of imagined hills, and the apparent texture of the terrain. Lines and angles were documented with care as the party tried to reconcile the fleeting vision with their understanding of Arctic geography. The sense of three-dimensionality perplexed the men, who were trained to navigate ice but now faced an anomaly that seemed solid, structured, and yet transient, defying all prior experience of the frozen landscape. Sleds and small boats laboured over uneven ice and drifting snow, yet the land seemed to recede in proportion to every forward step, as if aware of their pursuit. Men strained to make headway across ridged ice, measuring distances carefully while charting a course toward the elusive horizon. No matter how far they pressed, the land retained a persistent distance, teasing perception and challenging the reliability of compasses and sight lines. Each attempt to approach was meticulously logged, with observations of wind, light, and ice conditions noted. Despite their careful method, the apparition continued to resist capture, slipping across the horizon like a living image determined to evade the explorers. By midday, the outline had begun to waver, lines softening and blending into the sky, until the shape dissolved entirely, leaving nothing on the horizon but uniform ice and a pale, empty light. Peary noted the sudden disappearance with disbelief, highlighting how the horizon, once brimming with the promise of discovery, had reverted to endless whiteness. Observers described a sense of emptiness and disorientation, their charts suddenly devoid of reference points they had believed concrete. The phenomenon left an unsettling impression, as if the Arctic itself had claimed the land, erasing it from both perception and record, and leaving the men to navigate with renewed caution. The men exchanged uncertain glances, their conversations laced with wonder and disbelief, debating whether the land had ever existed or if the Arctic had conjured a fleeting phantom to mock their eyes. Some argued for optical illusions amplified by cold air and mirage effects, while others insisted that the land had tangible qualities too precise to be imaginary. Diary entries reveal tension between rational explanation and the visceral certainty of sight, as the explorers grappled with the limits of perception. Even seasoned observers acknowledged that their knowledge of Arctic geography offered no guidance, leaving them suspended between curiosity, caution, and an unnerving sense of vulnerability in the frozen expanse. Journals record every sketch, measurement, and note in meticulous detail, yet successive efforts to fix the land's location proved fruitless, revealing both the crew's dedication and the environment's unyielding enigma. Each set of coordinates was plotted with precision, yet the phantom land could not be reconciled with prior maps or repeated observation. Peary's attention to detail included wind direction, light conditions, and ice formations, yet none of these factors explained the land's sudden appearances and disappearances. The diaries convey frustration, interwoven with fascination, as the party confronted a phenomenon that adhered to its own rules, impervious to conventional navigation or expectation. Cross-referencing Peary's observations with known Arctic charts yielded no matching landforms, further unsettling the party and emphasizing the anomaly as a phenomenon without precedent in recorded exploration. Explorers consulted older maps, comparing notes with prior expeditions, yet nothing corresponded with what they had seen. The absence of corroborating data intensified the mystery, suggesting that either the land was ephemeral or that the Arctic could fabricate convincing forms from ice, snow, and light. This challenge to empirical observation left the men grappling with the reliability of their instruments, their charts, and even the testimony of their own eyes. Over the following days, attention to the horizon became habitual, as the men scanned relentlessly for any sign of the vanished land, aware that uncertainty had begun to shadow every decision and route. Every ridge, every distant ice mound was examined with heightened suspicion, as if the landscape itself could conceal and reveal phantom features at will. Journals reflect a shift in priorities. Observation, recording, and verification became central to survival, alongside navigation. Even routine travel required a heightened awareness, as the Arctic seemed to operate on rules beyond the explorer's comprehension, blending reality with illusion in ways that tested both patience and judgment. Peary's final reflections emphasize the persistent tension between empirical observation and the Arctic's capacity for illusion, suggesting that some truths in this frozen world may resist capture by chart or journal. The diaries convey an enduring uncertainty, a lingering question about whether the land had ever truly existed, or if it was a fleeting creation of atmosphere and perception. The phenomenon was never repeated in the same location, leaving a lasting imprint on the party's understanding of the Arctic. This unresolved encounter became both a caution and a fascination, reminding the explorers that the horizon could conceal secrets impervious to measurement or explanation. The land shimmered on the horizon like a fleeting dream, leaving only frozen silence where certainty should have stood. Sverdrup's ice that rang like metal. Beneath a pale Arctic sun, Sverdrup's men paused on the frozen expanse as a faint metallic tone drifted across the ice, seeming to emanate from nowhere yet everywhere at once. The sound was unlike any natural creaking or cracking of ice they had encountered before, resonating with an almost deliberate clarity. Diaries record the initial disbelief and speculation, with careful sketches of ice ridges and pressure fractures noted in the margins. Even the most experienced explorers were compelled to halt, listening with rapt attention as the tone vibrated through the soles of their boots, filling the air with an uncanny, persistent resonance that seemed to challenge the frozen silence itself. Crystalline ridges and pressure cracks twisted through the ice, each surface catching the light differently, amplifying and scattering sounds in ways the crew could not anticipate. Sunlight fractured across the surfaces, creating a shifting mosaic of brilliance and shadow, while subtle fissures hummed faintly, as if each crystal lattice possessed its own tonal quality. Sverdrup noted that even small changes in temperature and wind could alter the resonance, producing variations in pitch that were impossible to predict. Observers attempted to trace the paths of these sounds, yet the ice seemed to carry them unpredictably, creating a symphony of metallic echoes that amplified and disappeared without warning, leaving the men to question whether the phenomenon had a source at all. The men's initial bewilderment is evident in the journals, their attempts to trace the origin with footsteps and probing poles yielding only echoes that deepened the mystery. Each strike of a staff against ice produced unexpected reverberations, often returning at frequencies the human ear could scarcely follow. Even as they moved carefully along the frozen terrain, the metallic tones seemed to track them, changing subtly with every step. Some observers suggested hollow chambers beneath the surface, but Sverdrup's notes show skepticism, emphasizing that no sound could be conclusively tied to ice morphology alone. The crew became attuned to these anomalies, recording every tonal fluctuation in the hope of discerning a pattern, yet the ice resisted comprehension at every turn. The tones grew sharper and more insistent, rising and falling as though the ice itself were breathing, with vibrations felt through boots and sled runners alike. Men reported a peculiar sensation, a low thrum that seemed to resonate through bones, a physical accompaniment to the auditory phenomenon. The diary entries describe a mounting tension as the metallic calls intensified during periods of still air, only to subside when the wind rose or clouds shifted. Even the most disciplined observers admitted a creeping unease, as if the frozen terrain was not inert but subtly alive, its rhythms communicating in a language beyond human understanding, and compelling the crew to proceed with both caution and fascination. Instruments were tested, and blocks of ice were struck experimentally, yet no ordinary source could account for the complexity or resonance recorded in Sverdrup's meticulous notes. Thermometers, compasses, and simple measuring devices did not explain. Acoustic vibrations persisted irrespective of the tools used to quantify them. The explorers documented each attempt, noting pitch, duration, and intensity, yet the sound's unpredictability remained. At times, the ringing seemed to come from beneath the ice, while at others it appeared airborne, carried across ridges and hollows. Sverdrup expressed a combination of frustration and awe, acknowledging that the Arctic could produce phenomena both tangible and inexplicably elusive, challenging every assumption of sound propagation in extreme conditions. Windswept snow shifted subtly, carrying sounds over great distances, and the crew sensed an eerie responsiveness, as if the frozen world were attuned to their presence. Snowdrifts funneled vibrations across the surface, creating echoes that confounded perception, while thin sheets of ice flexed under weight, generating tones that seemed almost deliberate. Journal entries capture the sensation of being followed by the sound itself, noting how its intensity shifted with their movement and attention. The interplay of light, air and ice created a complex acoustic landscape, leaving observers unsure whether the metallic ringing was a natural effect, a sensory illusion, or something entirely beyond conventional explanation. Observers disagreed on the timbre and intensity. Some swore to hear ringing like distant bells, while others reported deep vibrating echoes that seemed to emanate from beneath the surface. Sverdrup's diary emphasizes the subjectivity of perception, acknowledging that the phenomenon's auditory impression varied between individuals. Even when standing side by side, crew members would describe contrasting experiences, leading to heated discussions and repeated testing. This divergence heightened the mystery, suggesting that the ice possessed qualities that could manipulate sound differently for each listener. The uncertainty cultivated both caution and fascination, reinforcing the Arctic as a place where empirical observation could be both compelling and fundamentally unreliable. Sverdrup's entries occasionally reference known acoustic phenomena, ice expansion, creaking pressures, but the clarity and persistence of the metallic tones defied conventional explanation. He meticulously differentiated between ordinary ice noises, such as contraction and cracking, and the unusual ringing that pervaded the frozen expanse. Measurements were taken at varying distances and times of day, yet no identifiable pattern emerged. Even after cross-referencing temperature and barometric readings, the anomaly remained inexplicable. The diary suggests a subtle admiration for the ice's inscrutability, portraying it as a medium that could produce sound independently, teasing observers with its resonance while remaining stubbornly beyond full comprehension. Nights brought heightened attentiveness, with the party listening across the dark, snowbound horizon, each sound amplifying the sense of the ice as an unpredictable, almost sentient landscape. Lantern light cast shadows across ridges and pressure cracks, enhancing the impression that the metallic tones were linked to the very structure of the frozen world. The diary recounts moments of eerie silence, broken suddenly by high-pitched rings, startling even seasoned explorers. Sleep became fitful, punctuated by subtle vibrations and echoes. Observers began to anticipate tones, adjusting camp positions and travel routes to accommodate them, yet the ice remained capricious, leaving a persistent tension that neither study nor distance could fully dissipate. In reflection, Sverdrup remarked on the anomaly's persistence, noting that despite careful observation, the ice retained its secret, leaving even the most practiced ears in doubt. He emphasized the combination of empirical diligence and awe in facing a phenomenon that refused categorization. The metallic ringing persisted under sunlight and cloud, wind and calm, offering no consistent source or explanation. Sverdrup's final entries convey both admiration and respect for the Arctic's capacity to confound understanding, portraying the frozen landscape as a living participant in the exploration rather than a passive backdrop. The ice's voice remained a reminder of the unknown, echoing through time and diary alike. Over the ice, metallic echoes hummed, a sound that belonged to the Arctic alone and yielded to no human inquiry. Kane's sun that rose in the wrong direction. Elisha Kent. Kane's journals from his 1855 Arctic expedition contain a perplexing entry that has puzzled historians and climatologists alike. The sun appeared to rise from an unusual direction, unsettling the rhythm of daily life and challenging the crew's sense of navigation. The phenomenon, noted during the expedition's prolonged winter travel, coincided with a period when the Arctic sky was often obscured by thin clouds, leaving the men uncertain whether this deviation was an optical illusion, an atmospheric anomaly, or something altogether unexplained. Kane meticulously recorded the angles and bearings of the sun, juxtaposing them against expected calculations, yet no natural explanation satisfied the observations. The morning in question began with the familiar, bone-chilling Arctic stillness, a quiet that carried over the endless expanse of snow and ice. Kane and his officers were accustomed to measuring time and direction by the sun's position, using it as a reliable guide amid the monotony of the polar winter. That morning, however, the first light struck the horizon at an angle that contradicted celestial tables. Instruments that had reliably guided them through previous months appeared to lose their authority, and men who had long relied on their own keen observations felt a sudden disorienting uncertainty. Kane's entry in his diary emphasises the methodical approach he took to verify the anomaly. Using a sextant, he measured the sun's elevation and azimuth at repeated intervals, comparing them against expected values for their latitude and season. The officers recorded their own observations, noting the way shadows fell upon the ice and the orientation of distant snowdrifts, which reflected the light in ways that should have been predictable. Despite these repeated measurements, the sun's path continued to defy expectation, as though the natural order of Arctic illumination had been subtly rewritten. The crew's reaction to the sun's behaviour extended beyond the realm of calculation. Men accustomed to rigorous schedules began to question their own sense of time, noting that watches and pocket chronometers seemed slightly misaligned with the light. Sleep cycles, already tenuous under polar conditions, were disrupted further as the dawn arrived from a direction inconsistent with the charts. Kane remarked on the tension among the men, observing that even disciplined temperaments were affected by the unsettling reversal of familiar cues, suggesting a psychological weight layered atop the physical anomaly. Kane's meticulous observations did not exist in isolation. He referenced previous Arctic expeditions, comparing their recorded solar bearings to his own. While occasional discrepancies in solar observation had been noted due to atmospheric refraction or topographical illusion, none matched the precise and consistent divergence documented by Kane. The diaries suggest he weighed the possibility of unusual meteorological effects, such as anomalous cloud refraction, yet the sun's behaviour persisted even under clear conditions, leaving the crew to confront an event that resisted conventional scientific reasoning. Beyond the immediate logistical concerns, the sun's aberrant rise became a subject of quiet speculation among the men. Some, recalling tales of polar phenomena from earlier voyages, whispered of strange lights and shifting horizons. Others focused on navigation, considering the potential consequences should this anomaly recur during travel over featureless ice. Kane, steadfast in his scientific rigour, documented these reactions as part of the broader narrative of Arctic exploration, presenting the interplay between observed fact and human perception without resorting to embellishment or fear-mongering. The physical environment seemed to amplify the strangeness of the morning. Snowfields that normally reflected light in predictable ways now cast elongated, distorted shadows, and the ice beneath their sledges appeared to shimmer in angles that contradicted prior experience. Kane's diary entries describe a disquieting stillness, a moment when the natural order appeared suspended. Every measurement he recorded, every notation of direction, seemed to carry an unspoken tension. The Arctic, in its frozen isolation, had revealed a subtle, inexplicable disorder that defied human expectation. Kane's documentation reveals a careful attempt to remain objective despite the mounting mystery. He sketched diagrams of sun angles, annotated bearings, and cross-referenced these with daily positions on the expedition's maps. Even the most skeptical officers could not ignore the consistency of the deviation. Their meticulous attention to detail, honed over months of arduous travel and dangerous conditions, confirmed that the anomaly was neither a singular misreading nor a fleeting illusion, yet its cause remained beyond the reach of contemporary understanding. Modern scholars reviewing Kane's records have speculated on atmospheric phenomena such as anomalous refraction, unusual ice crystal formations, or magnetic influences on perception. None of these explanations fully reconciles the precision with which Kane documented the sun's aberrant trajectory. While contemporary science offers potential natural causes, the entries convey a persistent sense of wonder and unease, capturing the moment when human expectation collided with the enigmatic behaviour of the Arctic environment. The sun, rising in a direction that contradicted charts, became more than a navigational curiosity. It was a symbol of the region's capacity to disrupt certainty and impose humility upon even the most disciplined explorers. Kane's careful notes, though precise and systematic, also preserve the sense of psychological strain and awe experienced by his men. Each day that followed brought measurements and observations, yet none resolved the anomaly, leaving the expedition to navigate a landscape where the simplest markers of time and direction could no longer be trusted. The Arctic horizon held its secret, a silent enigma that left even the most meticulous observers questioning the very order of the natural world. Franklin's men watching the ice move against the wind. Massive sheets of ice slid silently across the Arctic waters, moving in direct opposition to the wind that howled across the frozen horizon. Franklin's men watched in bewilderment as the enormous floes advanced steadily, indifferent to the gusts that should have pushed them in the opposite direction. The sun, pale and low, glinted off their jagged edges, creating shifting patterns of light that made distances difficult to judge. Observers noted the eerie uniformity of the movement, recording angles and distances in hurried entries while a quiet tension settled over the camp, as if the ice itself had decided to act outside natural law. Confusion spread quickly among the crew, each man measuring the movement with trained eyes, yet finding no pattern that aligned with known Arctic currents. Some knelt to mark tracks in the snow, tracing shadows and cracks for clues, while others climbed nearby ridges to gain a higher vantage point. Every attempt to reconcile observation with expectation failed. Maps and charts consulted for reference seemed powerless to explain the phenomenon. Whispers moved quietly among the men, conjecture mingling with caution, as they collectively sensed that the ice's behaviour was neither random nor accidental, but deliberate in a manner no one could yet comprehend. Instruments were consulted repeatedly, compasses checked and rechecked, while logbooks filled with meticulous records that confirmed a drift both deliberate and inexplicable. Franklin and his officers documented each deviation with painstaking care, noting every measurement of wind, tide, and current. Even their most skeptical sailors could not dismiss the evidence, and repeated observations produced the same astonishing result. Thermometers and barometers, while functioning normally, provided no insight into the anomaly. The crew's confidence in physical law began to waver, tempered by the quiet authority of evidence that refused to bend to expectation. Around them, the landscape remained unnervingly still, snow and ice forming familiar shapes even as entire floes defied the forces that should govern them. Snowdrifts remained aligned with the prevailing gusts, and the horizon's distant peaks suggested order in a scene otherwise impossible to rationalize. Yet the massive ice sheets pressed forward with a deliberate momentum, seemingly guided by a hidden force. Every reflective surface, every shimmer of sunlight off the ice seemed to accentuate the incongruity, as if the environment itself were highlighting the strangeness. Men paused mid-task, frozen in observation, uncertain whether to follow the ice or continue their routine labour. Tension settled in quietly, a shared unease magnified by the persistent contradiction between expectation and observation, leaving the men to question the reliability of their own senses. Their logs reveal moments of hesitation, a slow realization that nothing in prior training or experience could fully account for what they witnessed. The ice moved as though obeying a law outside known physics, and even the most disciplined officers recorded a faint tremor of doubt. Private journals speak of a subtle fear, not of immediate danger, but of confronting a phenomenon that refused classification, a pattern that could not be reconciled with human understanding. Consulting notes from prior expeditions only deepened the mystery, for no previous record described ice moving with such consistent resistance to wind and current. Franklin himself referenced reports from Parry and Ross, finding only fleeting mentions of ice that shifted strangely, never in a sustained, observable pattern. The journals reveal the men's careful cross-referencing, attempting to find precedent for what they were seeing, yet every comparison fell short. The anomaly remained unique, a phenomenon of both magnitude and subtlety that distinguished their expedition from all that had preceded it, leaving the Arctic once again as a landscape of unknowable behaviours. Day after day the pattern endured, a slow and hypnotic motion that drew eyes toward the horizon, compelling the men to follow each drifting block with anxious fascination. Observers noted the rhythm of movement, the way smaller floes were drawn along with larger ones, maintaining relative alignment despite opposing winds. The monotony of Arctic travel intensified the effect, magnifying the strangeness of repetition. Men sketched diagrams, described motions in notebooks, and compared successive days' observations, each attempt reinforcing the reality of the phenomenon. Even after weeks, the ice continued its silent march, a living contradiction that challenged assumptions about the forces shaping the polar landscape. The Arctic seemed to breathe around them, a subtle pulse in the ice and the wind, suggesting a landscape with a will of its own, indifferent to human understanding. Frost-laden ridges and jagged pinnacles stood motionless, as the enormous floes shifted beneath them, carrying the illusion of order alongside undeniable chaos. Sounds of cracking and shifting ice punctuated the silence, a rhythmic accompaniment to the visible movement. The diaries hint at a sense that the land and sea together were testing the limits of perception, that every observation brought the men closer to understanding, and yet farther from resolution. The officers debated quietly, offering explanations rooted in tides, hidden currents, and underwater pressure, yet none sufficed to account for the persistent anomaly before them. Practical minds sought natural laws, referencing oceanographic principles, while philosophers among the crew noted the eerie semblance of intention. Journals record lengthy discussions and sketches, attempts to model forces at work, yet all models fell short. Observation trumped theory. As the men recorded yet another day of defiant ice, it became clear that no calculation or previous knowledge could fully encompass the Arctic's subtle rebellion. By the final observation, the crew had grown both weary and mesmerized, aware that the ice's deliberate defiance was more than a physical puzzle. It was a challenge to perception itself. Repetition, scale, and silent motion combined to create a scene that felt almost sentient, as if the Arctic were performing an inscrutable experiment on those who ventured into its frozen heart. In the officers' journals, there is a sense of resigned wonder, an acknowledgement that some mysteries do not yield to analysis, and some truths remain hidden behind layers of frost and shadow. Throughout the icy terrain, a silent contradiction endured, a choreography of ice and wind that left the men to wonder whether the Arctic obeyed laws known to humankind, or secrets guarded only by the relentless drift itself. Hall's compass that pointed south at the pole. Hall observed with growing concern as the compass needle swung inexplicably toward the south, an orientation that contradicted every expectation for their polar latitude. Beneath the pale Arctic light, the frozen expanse stretched endlessly, and yet the needle seemed to carve a path entirely independent of known magnetic principles. Hall's journal records the precise angles and repeated readings, each entry a meticulous attempt to capture a phenomenon that resisted ordinary explanation. The men around him murmured, casting glances at one another as the familiar tools of navigation, the instruments they relied upon without question, appeared suddenly unreliable in the grip of the polar wilderness. Determined to rule out error, he methodically recalibrated the instrument, taking repeated readings beneath the unbroken whiteness of the sky, while noting every detail. Each measurement was carefully cross-checked with maps and previously recorded positions, yet the needle refused to return to expected bearings. Hall's notes reflect an obsessive commitment to precision. The minute deviations were recorded alongside temperature, barometric pressure, and exact time, as though cataloguing the anomaly might reveal its hidden cause. Even the officers most skeptical of supernatural explanations found themselves unable to account for the stubborn defiance of the magnetic needle. The crew watched quietly, some leaning close to inspect the needle's defiance, their usual certainty in navigation subtly eroded by the anomaly before them. Sled dogs shuffled nervously, sensing perhaps the tension that the men felt but could not articulate. Logs describe officers comparing readings aloud, voices low in concentration and occasionally rising in frustration as repeated trials confirmed the same impossible result. The quiet of the Arctic accentuated every movement of the needle, and each subtle swing seemed amplified against the vast emptiness of snow and ice, leaving men to wonder whether the environment itself had shifted in a way science could not yet define. Around the expedition, ice and snow stretched endlessly, yet the magnetic conditions near the pole created a subtle tension, a reminder that familiar instruments often faltered at extreme latitudes. Hall's diary entries reference previous observations of magnetic variation and compass behaviour, demonstrating awareness that the Earth's field becomes increasingly complex near the pole. Still, the The anomaly they observed differed in precision and persistence, a reversal so complete that no known calculation accounted for it. The horizon remained flat and unbroken, a cold, silent witness to the subtle drama unfolding at the fingertips of the explorers. Multiple observations over several days confirm the compass's stubborn deviation, each reading reinforcing a puzzling consistency that no earthly logic seemed to explain. Hall's attention to detail left no angle unmeasured, and yet the pattern repeated with unwavering reliability. The officers themselves began to record minor emotional responses alongside technical measurements, acknowledging a sense of unease that mingled with scientific curiosity. Even the routine acts of sledging and setting camp were tinged with subtle doubt, the men constantly aware that the instruments they trusted so implicitly were signalling something entirely unexpected. The sky above remained pale and unbroken, reflecting light across the frozen terrain, yet the stark stillness could not conceal the disquiet that grew alongside the needle's persistent southward pull. Cracks in the ice and distant snowdrifts reflected light in ways that underscored the emptiness of the landscape, as if the polar environment itself had taken on a silent authority. Hall's diary captures the way light shifted across surfaces and how each reflection seemed to emphasize the unreliability of human perception against the enduring mystery of magnetic forces. The Arctic, so silent and vast, appeared at once familiar and alien, its laws partially known but not fully comprehended. By aligning his notes with older Arctic records, Hall discovered that while magnetic variation has been noted before, none described so precise and sustained a reversal at the pole itself. References to earlier explorers show minor deviations, fluctuations, and anomalies, but Hall's observations were remarkable in their repeatability and clarity. The journals reveal a careful review of prior expeditions, a deliberate attempt to place the anomaly within a broader context of polar science. Yet even this historical comparison offered little comfort, leaving Hall and his men to confront a phenomenon both verifiable and unexplainable, a riddle etched into the ice and air of the extreme north. Practical concerns arose as the crew relied on the compass for direction during sledging and camp placement, forcing men to reconcile trust in their instruments with an unsettling uncertainty. Hall's careful guidance attempted to balance the anomaly with known landmarks and celestial cues, but even minor deviations caused hesitation in movement and planning. Journal excerpts note that the men began to rely more heavily on triangulation and observation than the compass, their confidence shaken but not entirely lost. Every adjustment, every precaution, reinforced the strange tension between human skill and the Arctic's subtle, almost imperceptible defiance. Hall reflected in his journal on the limits of human understanding, documenting hypotheses grounded in observable magnetic phenomena, yet admitting that no theory fully accounted for the compass's behaviour. He recorded ideas about local magnetic irregularities, iron deposits, and geomagnetic forces, but each was speculative, framed carefully as a potential explanation, rather than a definitive answer. The entries convey both rigour and humility, portraying an explorer confronting evidence that outstripped contemporary knowledge. For Hall, the compass became a symbol of the delicate boundary between observation and interpretation, a reminder that some natural truths remain tantalizingly beyond reach. In the final entry, the needle's unwavering defiance had become a symbol of the Arctic's subtle authority, a reminder that even the most disciplined observer could encounter forces beyond comprehension. The crew, trained in precision and accustomed to harsh conditions, recorded every detail with the care of scientists, yet the anomaly persisted without alteration. Even as sledges moved and days passed, the compass refused to align with expected bearings, leaving a lingering uncertainty that no calculation could dispel. The Arctic's silence, broken only by the wind and occasional groan of ice, seemed to guard a secret that would remain just beyond human understanding. The compass, steadfast in its inexplicable course, seemed to hint at a hidden order beneath the ice, a secret the Arctic withheld from all who ventured too close. De Long's recurring Arctic lights beneath cloud cover. On nights when the sky remained heavy with clouds, the crew of the Jeannette recorded pale, undulating lights that seemed to shimmer beneath the frozen canopy. The Arctic night was deep and relentless, yet these luminous arcs moved with an almost deliberate rhythm, appearing and fading across the clouded expanse. De Long's journal notes the first sightings with precision, including direction, duration, and intensity, suggesting that even the harshest, most isolated conditions could not suppress the phenomenon. Men who had grown accustomed to the monotony of ice and wind found themselves captivated, unable to tear their eyes from the faint glow above. Sailors and officers alike paused in their tasks, eyes lifted toward the strange illumination, uncertain whether to marvel or fear the apparition above. Footsteps fell silent across the frozen deck as crew members exchanged quiet observations, the usual hum of Arctic activity momentarily suspended. The lights reflected faintly off the snow, creating shimmering patterns across the ice, yet the source remained elusive, hidden beneath the cloud layer. Even those most skeptical of extraordinary explanations admitted a creeping unease, noting in private diaries a sense of being observed or tested by forces beyond immediate comprehension. The glow moved in faint arcs, shifting colour from green to silver, and flickered as if responding to some unseen current hidden within the Arctic atmosphere. Each appearance differed subtly, with some arcs stretching across the horizon while others appeared as brief, localised flares. Observers attempted to document these variations, sketching the patterns in notebooks and comparing successive nights' occurrences. Though faint, the lights cast shadows that seemed almost tangible, bending across ice ridges and reflecting from distant snowdrifts in ways that challenged perception. For the men, the lights were both a spectacle and an enigma, impossible to ignore yet impossible to fully understand. Around them, snow and ice reflected the feeble light, while the dense cloud layer muted the horizon, rendering distance ambiguous and the source of illumination elusive. The landscape, normally defined by stark lines of ridge and flow, appeared softened and shifting under the ephemeral glow. Even small undulations in the ice cast strange shadows that intertwined with the lights, creating the impression of movement within movement. The diary entries frequently mention the difficulty of judging scale or proximity, reinforcing the subtle disorientation induced by a phenomenon grounded in reality, yet appearing almost supernatural. De Long and his officers speculated on familiar causes, aurora, reflected moonlight, or atmospheric refraction, but none of these explanations matched the consistent pattern they observed. The aurora, while often visible in the Arctic sky, never appeared beneath such thick cloud cover with the same steady arcs. Moonlight filtered through dense layers could not produce the undulating hues recorded in the logbooks. Even reflections from ice or snow fell short as explanations, leaving the crew to acknowledge a persistent anomaly that resisted conventional reasoning and pointed to the unknown in the polar night. With each passing night, the phenomenon reappeared, a recurring spectacle that the men meticulously logged, noting its timing, shape, and the subtle differences from one evening to the next. Patterns emerged in frequency and duration, though no human or natural law fully accounted for them. Journal entries detail hours spent observing, measuring, and sketching, revealing the expedition's commitment to recording the unexplained with scientific care. Over time, the recurrence lent weight to the mystery, emphasizing that these were not fleeting illusions or tricks of the eye, but a reproducible, observable event defying easy explanation. The repeated sightings lent a weight to the event that unsettled some and fascinated others, embedding a quiet tension within the otherwise routine tasks of the crew. Sledging, ice repairs, and navigation continued, yet the mind remained divided between duty and the unrelenting spectacle above. Some men spoke in hushed tones of otherworldly presences, while officers noted the physiological and psychological impact of extended nights under low light. Even in moments of apparent calm, the Arctic's glow persisted in memory, haunting the edges of observation and imagination alike. Detailed notes of wind, temperature, and visibility accompanied each account, anchoring the observations in verifiable environmental conditions, while leaving the lights themselves inexplicable. The diaries record cloud density, snow quality, and even subtle variations in wind direction, emphasizing the meticulous care of De Long's crew. Every measurement reinforced the strangeness of the light's recurrence, for no environmental factor consistently correlated with the phenomenon. In documenting what could be observed, the men acknowledged what remained unseen, a hidden dimension of the Arctic sky that eluded both perception and theory. Even in reflection, the glowing arcs resisted complete understanding, revealing the limits of both scientific knowledge and human perception against the Arctic's vast indifferent expanse. Later analyses would note that atmospheric luminescence of this kind could have multiple causes, yet the specifics of de Long's descriptions, beneath heavy clouds with repeated timing and subtle colour shifts, remained unmatched in other recorded expeditions. The men wrote with an acute awareness of being witnesses to something rare, something that invited explanation yet refused the finality of certainty, a phenomenon that lingered on the border between nature and enigma. At the close of the recorded observations, the lights remained as elusive as ever, a subtle, persistent defiance of explanation that lingered in memory as much as in the sky. The Arctic night carried on in quiet monotony, but the glow continued to haunt the edges of the horizon, a whisper of movement and colour that could neither be predicted nor ignored. Even as the crew pressed forward on routine tasks, the recurring spectacle persisted in thought and journal, a reminder that the polar world still held secrets inaccessible to measurement, imagination, or expectation. With clouds stretching endlessly above, the Arctic glowed with an unclaimed light, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to reveal a secret that no one would ever fully decipher. Parry's crew witnessing a second moon. During one long winter night on Parry's Arctic expedition, the crew noticed an unusual sight in the sky, a pale shape that did not belong to the familiar moon. Its presence was subtle at first, a faint glow that seemed to linger just above the horizon, yet it drew attention immediately. Officers recorded its appearance in diaries, describing a dim secondary orb hovering beside the primary moon in a way that defied expectation. The ice and snow reflected its muted light unevenly, giving the landscape an ethereal quality that made the familiar polar terrain seem foreign and slightly distorted. Men paused their work on the ice, their eyes drawn upward, uncertainty flickering across faces that had grown accustomed to the frozen world. Sledges lay temporarily still, and conversations fell to whispers as observers compared what they saw with what they knew of lunar behaviour. Even the most experienced crew members, accustomed to the extremes of Arctic night and prolonged isolation, hesitated to offer explanations, recording only what they observed. The anomaly seemed to assert itself in silence, persistent yet elusive, leaving those who witnessed it with a mixture of curiosity and unease. A second dim orb hovered beside the main moon, casting a ghostly reflection over snowdrifts and ice ridges with subtle, eerie light. Unlike the familiar moon, it lacked the same clarity and brilliance, producing shadows that appeared blurred and inconsistent. Officers attempted to sketch its position relative to the primary moon, noting its angle, apparent diameter, and faint halo, while sailors observed the shifting brightness with scrutiny. The light carried no warmth, no direct energy, yet it altered the perception of the surrounding landscape, transforming ridges, ice formations, and distant flows into forms that seemed almost spectral. The frozen horizon seemed altered beneath this illumination, distances warped, and familiar contours rendered strange in the dim glow. Snow ridges that normally appeared flat and uniform took on a rolling, fluid appearance, and ice patches that had seemed permanent now appeared to ripple with the motion of the unseen light. Observers noted that even small drifts seemed to cast unusual shadows, giving the impression of subtle movement in a landscape that should have been frozen and unchanging. The twin moon glow made the Arctic world feel unfamiliar, its consistency and persistence introducing a quiet, persistent tension among the crew. Parry's journals recorded attempts to explain the anomaly, noting that reflections, halos, or thin clouds could not account for the repeated observation. Astronomical knowledge of lunar cycles offered no solution, as the event repeated across several nights under different conditions. Observers considered the position of the moon, the thickness of cloud cover, and the potential for optical illusions caused by ice crystals, yet every factor fell short. The records suggest a meticulous commitment to rational explanation, even when the phenomenon defied logic, demonstrating the expedition's dedication to observation and the limits of empirical certainty. Each night the strange companion returned, shifting slightly in angle and intensity, demanding careful attention and meticulous notation from officers and sailors alike. Observations included sketches, time-stamped notes and comparative measurements, highlighting the recurrence of the anomaly and the effort to identify patterns. Small variations in brightness or relative position added complexity, suggesting that the phenomenon was neither random nor entirely fixed, yet its repeated appearance created the impression of a deliberate presence in the polar sky. The men's vigilance became part of the routine, as much a duty as sledging or ice maintenance, intertwining the extraordinary with the ordinary. Threads of awe and unease wove through the men, threading tension into the otherwise routine tasks of sledging and maintaining the ice camp. Conversations were muted, often stopping abruptly when the second moon reappeared, and officers occasionally referenced the need to remain alert while recording observations. The anomaly affected not just perception but also morale, creating a quiet undercurrent of wonder and apprehension. Some men remarked in private notes about a sensation of being observed, or of the Arctic night harbouring mysteries beyond their comprehension, though these accounts were never sensationalised, only carefully documented. Comparisons with prior Arctic records revealed no similar occurrences, highlighting the singularity of Parry's twin moon sighting. No expedition notes mentioned a companion moon appearing beside the real one, nor did contemporary astronomers provide references for such a visual effect at that latitude. The lack of precedent added weight to the observation, confirming the uniqueness of what Parry and his crew recorded. Scholars reviewing the logs later noted the meticulousness of the records and the absence of known natural explanations, underscoring the enduring mystery and the impossibility of reducing the event to ordinary phenomena. In attempting to reconcile empirical recording with the subtle impossibility of what they saw, observers were caught between disciplined scrutiny and the growing sense that the polar sky could defy expectation. The twin moon remained consistent enough to document, yet its very presence challenged understanding of celestial mechanics. Officers and sailors alike maintained professional restraint, recording position, luminosity, and apparent diameter, yet the personal reflections reveal a quiet tension, a recognition that something was occurring in the Arctic sky that the limits of science could not easily explain. This tension added depth to the experience, intertwining observation with the psychological weight of confronting the inexplicable. By the last recorded sighting, the twin moons remained unexplained, a subtle, persistent mystery lingering above the frozen expanse. The light continued to alter perception of the horizon, emphasizing the Arctic's capacity to transform the ordinary into the uncanny. Even after the expedition moved on, memories of the twin moon endured in the logs and personal accounts, leaving a record of a phenomenon that resisted conventional classification. The men had documented its existence without resolution, leaving posterity with both evidence and uncertainty, a testament to the enigmatic power of the polar night. Hovering silently above the ice, the spectral twin suggested that the heavens held secrets beyond the reach of human understanding. Ray's dogs refusing to cross empty ice. The sled team halted abruptly on the unbroken ice, their usual momentum arrested by a hesitation that no one could immediately explain. The men exchanged glances, each noting the unusual stillness that spread through the animals. Snow and ice stretched in every direction, featureless and flat, yet the dogs refused to advance, as though some unseen barrier held them in place. Ray observed silently, aware that the Arctic could produce subtle, unexpected cues invisible to human eyes, yet this behaviour exceeded anything previously encountered. The quiet persisted, punctuated only by the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and the occasional whisper of wind across the ice. John Ray and his men leaned forward, voices firm yet calm, trying to coax the dogs across terrain that appeared entirely safe and familiar. Commands were repeated in measured tones, hands extended with the small incentives that usually encouraged movement. The animals shifted uneasily, but did not respond, glancing toward the horizon with unease, as if detecting some signal beyond human perception. Ray's journal notes record his own growing concern, highlighting both the precision of his observations and the sense of helplessness in confronting instinctual resistance he could neither interpret nor override. Around them, the flat expanse of ice stretched endlessly, gleaming in the dim light, devoid of any visual obstacle or threat. No cracks, ridges, or sudden dips marred the surface, and distant ice flows appeared stationary and unobstructed. The horizon seemed interminable, a pale line dividing snow from sky, yet the dog's attention was fixed on an invisible boundary that no eye could confirm. The ordinary monotony of Arctic terrain had been disrupted by an entirely inexplicable factor, leaving the men to confront a tension between observation and instinct, fact and inexplicable sensation. The dogs' bodies tensed, ears flicking, tails rigid, and a low, almost imperceptible growl ran through the team. Each animal appeared hyper-aware of something beyond sight, noses quivering and muscles coiled in anticipation. Even the strongest, most dependable sled dogs hesitated, their training and experience overridden by a reaction that seemed instinctual and unexplainable. Ray and the men could only watch, noting the synchrony of behaviour and the eerie precision with which the animals avoided the invisible threshold, a line that should not have existed. The ice beneath their paws sometimes carried subtle vibrations imperceptible to human senses, a tremor that might have alerted the dogs to shifting plates or distant cracking. Ray observed that while the men felt only the solid expanse beneath their boots, the dogs reacted with uncanny precision, pausing or shifting direction in response to imperceptible cues. Diaries note repeated instances where the animals seemed to read the ice itself, the hesitation reflecting an instinct honed for survival in the polar environment. Even in the absence of visible hazards, these perceptive reactions suggested the dogs detected patterns beyond human comprehension. Ray considered every natural cause, thin ice, distant wind gusts, or subtle optical effects, but none aligned with the repeated behaviour. There were no signs of cracking, no temperature fluctuations that might account for caution, and no visual distortions to explain the pause. Every factor that could be measured or recorded was consistent with safe passage, yet the dogs refused. These attempts at rational explanation appear throughout his journals, demonstrating a methodical mind confronting a phenomenon that tested the boundaries of reason. This strange behaviour occurred over multiple stretches of ice, each incident reinforcing the crew's sense that something invisible yet tangible influenced the dogs. Over several days, the team encountered similar episodes, sometimes at midday, other times in the dim polar twilight. Every occurrence followed a pattern: sudden hesitation, careful observation, and an eventual withdrawal or redirection of the sled. Each repetition deepened the mystery, suggesting that whatever affected the animals was neither random nor momentary, yet remained imperceptible to human senses. Looking back at historical records of sled teams, Ray compared these episodes and noted that no prior expedition described animals reacting so consistently to empty ice. Previous journeys had documented hesitation only when obvious dangers appeared, such as thin ice, crevasses, or drifting pressure ridges. Yet his dogs refused to move across unbroken, featureless terrain. The anomaly's repetition, noted meticulously in logs, underscored its singularity and deepened the crew's attention. It became evident that what they were witnessing could not be explained by ordinary environmental cues or fatigue, marking this behaviour as an unprecedented and quietly unsettling phenomenon in Arctic exploration. Unease crept into the men as the routine familiarity of their journey was disrupted by instinctual warnings they could neither see nor interpret. Conversations became quieter, eyes drifted toward the horizon with renewed scrutiny, and movements were measured, cautious. The Arctic, usually known for its harsh but comprehensible dangers, now appeared to hold secrets beyond empirical measurement. Even seasoned men found themselves questioning whether the environment could conceal subtle phenomena that influence behaviour without leaving visible traces. Guiding the sled forward, gentle tugs, verbal commands, and even light physical encouragement proved ineffective against the dog's inexplicable caution. No amount of prompting overcame the instinctual pause, and men began to respect the animal's judgment as a subtle form of knowledge. Observers documented both the failure of human authority and the undeniable precision of canine perception, noting that the dog's behaviour consistently indicated some factor outside ordinary comprehension. Their refusal became a silent language, an unspoken warning whose origin remained elusive. Detailed logs captured each episode meticulously, noting exact locations, ice conditions, time of day, and the dog's behaviour. Ray's methodical records reveal both his diligence and the persistence of uncertainty, reflecting a disciplined attempt to understand the phenomenon. Even when no explanation could be discerned, the act of recording provided a framework for grappling with the inexplicable. The journals offer a testament to observation under extreme conditions, demonstrating a rare encounter where instinct prevailed over logic, yet documentation preserved the anomaly for future consideration. When the final observation was recorded, the phenomenon remained unresolved, leaving the men to navigate a landscape where instinct outweighed reason. The ice appeared empty and stable, yet the dog's behaviour suggested the presence of something imperceptible, a subtle force that challenged the human perception of reality. Ray's entries leave no conclusion, only careful notation and an acknowledgement that some Arctic mysteries reveal themselves only to the senses attuned beyond human sight, recorded but never fully explained. The ice lay utterly empty, yet the dog's stubborn paws hinted at a presence that existed beyond human perception, intangible and unseen. Ross's ice cliffs that appeared overnight. When the morning light revealed the horizon, the crew froze at the sight of immense ice walls that had not existed the night before. What had been a flat, featureless expanse now rose into vertical cliffs, their sheer faces catching the pale Arctic sunlight in jagged streaks. Men instinctively reached for their journals and measuring tools, uncertain whether they faced a natural phenomenon, an optical illusion, or the subtle caprice of the frozen world itself. Silence fell over the camp as the crew stared, the ordinary rhythm of sledges and ice maintenance replaced by a quiet, uneasy awe. The flat expanse they had traversed only hours earlier was now interrupted by towering vertical formations, their surfaces fractured and ridged, shimmering in layers of white and pale blue. The horizon seemed to have been rewritten overnight, presenting a topography that contradicted every expectation and measurement from the previous day. Even distant snowfields appeared distorted under the reflection of these new structures, creating shadows and angles that disoriented the men's sense of scale. The familiar landscape had become alien, and with it came a growing sense that the Arctic could conceal transformations invisible until observed. James Clark Ross and his officers scrambled to record measurements and sketches, each man grappling with disbelief at the sudden transformation of the landscape. Compasses and sextants were deployed, positions marked meticulously, yet none of the data could account for the cliff's abrupt appearance. Journals were filled with precise annotations, height estimates, distance between ridges, orientation relative to prior landmarks. The men worked with both scientific rigour and a creeping unease, aware that what they documented might never be fully explainable, yet compelled to preserve a record of the impossible. The cliffs stretched for miles, their heights varying unpredictably, surfaces jagged with fractures, and faces streaked with layers of compressed ice, reflecting light in shifting patterns. Some sections bore smooth vertical lines as if sculpted by immense pressure, while others were carved with deep fissures, hinting at violent internal movement. Crests and ledges caught sunlight differently, producing illusions of depth and movement, while distant portions appeared almost translucent, as if the ice itself had absorbed and refracted light unusually. The scale and irregularity made it difficult to estimate the true dimensions, reinforcing the sense that the landscape had transformed beyond comprehension. Turning a closer eye to the cliffs revealed faint striations and subtle layering, suggesting forces of pressure and ice flow that even Ross had rarely observed firsthand. Thin, compressed lines traced the walls' faces, interspersed with slight variations in colour and translucence that hinted at repeated cycles of freezing, thawing, and internal movement. Ross carefully recorded these patterns in his sketches, noting how the layering implied a gradual accumulation of stress now revealed in a sudden, dramatic formation. The phenomenon challenged both expectation and understanding, as the cliffs combined the evidence of slow glacial processes with the immediacy of an overnight transformation. Ross considered explanations rooted in ice dynamics, pressure ridges, carving events, or wind-formed accumulations, but each hypothesis seemed insufficient to account for the speed and scale of their appearance. Even the sudden collapse of distant glaciers could not produce formations of such vertical magnitude in a single night. Observations of nearby ice flows and previous mapping confirmed the prior flatness, leaving the crew with no conventional geological or meteorological explanation. The combination of suddenness, scale, and isolation created a puzzle that neither calculation nor conjecture could resolve. Observations made just the evening prior confirmed that the ice had lain flat and unbroken, emphasizing the mystery of cliffs that seemed to materialize in the span of hours. The men recalled that no windstorm or unusual temperature fluctuation had occurred during the night, and yet the terrain had been irrevocably altered. Sketches from previous days provided a stark contrast, showing smooth ridges and gently rolling snowfields where now stood vertical walls. The abruptness suggested that the Arctic environment could conceal rapid changes, producing features that defied ordinary temporal expectations. The men advanced cautiously, aware that the altered terrain could conceal hidden cracks or sudden drops, their senses heightened by both awe and unease. Sledge runners were guided carefully over ice that looked deceptively stable, and each step was accompanied by the low creak of compressed snow underfoot. Observers noted that shadows cast by the cliffs created false impressions of depth, and distant edges seemed to shift slightly with changing light, as though the formations themselves were in subtle motion. Even seasoned explorers found themselves wary, forced to respect both the ice's unpredictability and the landscape's newfound strangeness. Meticulous notes, diagrams, and sketches captured the cliff's dimensions and irregularities, forming a detailed record even as the phenomenon resisted explanation. Measurements of vertical faces, estimations of surface texture, and detailed drawings of fractured sections were all recorded with precision. Officers commented on anomalies such as hidden ledges, overhanging cornices, and sections where the ice appeared unnaturally translucent. These records, carefully preserved in Ross's journals, provided a rare instance of Arctic observation where empirical documentation coexisted with an enduring mystery. When placed alongside other Arctic expeditions, Ross's sighting was singular. While calving and ice formation were known, nothing documented suggested cliffs could appear overnight with such sudden magnitude. References to earlier voyages described pressure ridges or temporary flows, yet none suggested vertical walls of this scale materializing in hours. Contemporary and later explorers studying Ross's notes recognized the event as exceptional, underscoring the Arctic's capacity to surprise even those most familiar with its patterns. The cliffs remained a benchmark of Arctic mystery, a phenomenon recorded but not resolved. At the sun setting, the ice walls remained unchanged, monumental and inexplicable, a stark reminder of the Arctic's capacity to surprise and intimidate. The men withdrew to camp, their thoughts heavy with both wonder and uncertainty, each step measured against the knowledge that the frozen world could conceal transformations from one hour to the next. Even in rest, the cliffs loomed in memory, their scale and suddenness impossible to ignore or dismiss. The frozen barriers loomed silently, as though the Arctic itself had reshaped its boundaries while no human eye watched. Greely's mysterious echoes beneath the ice. A low, pulsing sound reverberated through the frozen plain, drawing the men's attention before they could identify its origin. The distant hum rose and fell with a peculiar rhythm, carrying across miles of ice with clarity that contradicted the expected muffling of the snow-covered landscape. Greely noted in his journal that the sound was unlike ordinary cracking or groaning of the ice. It was measured, deliberate, and seemed to resonate from somewhere below the frozen surface. The men stood in silence, listening intently, struck by a sense that the ice itself had become a vessel for something unseen. Each pulse lingered just long enough to unsettle, leaving echoes that interwove with the wind and the groaning of distant glaciers. The ice sheets stretched endlessly, flat and unbroken, yet every step seemed to amplify the faint rhythmic vibrations emanating from beneath. Winds scoured the surface in intermittent gusts, lifting snow into swirling eddies, but the pulses continued undisturbed, unaffected by the elements above. Observers remarked that the emptiness surrounding them intensified the sensation, creating an almost acoustic lens that carried the sounds farther than any could have anticipated. Even the veteran men, accustomed to the Arctic's subtle cues, were unsettled by the way the echoes moved through the landscape. Footfalls and distant sled movements seemed to blend into the low hum, as if the ice itself was an instrument resonating with invisible hands. Unlike the sharp cracks and groans familiar to Arctic travellers, these echoes were steady, patterned, and strangely persistent. They came in intervals that suggested intentionality, a cadence that could not be traced to ice-shifting wind or the distant fracture of glaciers. Instruments placed upon the surface failed to register measurable shifts corresponding to the sound, leaving the crew to rely on their ears and the impressions noted in careful, repeated observation. Even when multiple men reported the echoes simultaneously, their descriptions matched with uncanny precision. The sound was hollow, continuous, and occasionally vibrated through the soles of their boots. Greely and his officers moved cautiously, placing hands against the ice and listening intently for the source, while the crew shared whispered observations of the uncanny sounds. Some men reported that the pulses seemed to travel in arcs, bouncing across the frozen expanse in ways that distorted their perception of distance and origin. The ice beneath their feet, usually a stable medium, became a conduit of uncertainty. Each vibration was catalogued mentally, every echo prompting new questions about the origin, depth, and mechanism behind the mystery. Several observers noted a faint metallic undertone within the resonance, subtle but consistent, suggesting an unknown interaction between ice and seawater below. Initial explanations, from shifting ice pressure to distant underwater currents, failed to account for the consistency, timing, and clarity of the resonant pulses. The expedition considered that tidal movements beneath the sea might transmit vibrations, yet the echoes persisted during periods of minimal tidal activity. Ice cracking alone could not replicate the measured, almost musical intervals noted in the journals. Each hypothesis illuminated a facet of Arctic physics, but left the core enigma unresolved, challenging the crew's understanding of their environment. Even the most experienced officers admitted in private notes that they could not reconcile the phenomenon with known natural processes. Every incident was meticulously logged, noting exact coordinates, temperature, wind conditions, and the echo's rhythm, as Greely sought patterns within the inexplicable phenomenon. Observations were paired with sketches indicating directionality and amplitude, an attempt to quantify an event that eluded conventional measurement. The officer in charge of records remarked on the strangeness of documenting something so tangible in sound yet intangible in source, a reality that demanded both scientific rigour and a willingness to confront the limits of human perception. Greely cross-referenced the occurrences with previous ice surveys, confirming that no recent fractures or carving events could account for the timing or persistence of the pulses. Over several days, the sounds recurred in different locations, each repetition reinforcing both the regularity and the unresolved nature of the mystery beneath the ice. Even areas previously crossed without incident produced the same low hum, suggesting that the phenomenon was not bound to a single point, but could emerge wherever the ice allowed it. Patterns appeared, yet none offered definitive clues, and the crew grew increasingly conscious of a hidden world beneath their feet, one that existed apart from sight and yet left a profound impression on the senses. On multiple occasions, attempts to drop weighted instruments through holes in the ice produced no detectable disturbance, deepening the enigma. An additional layer of unease arose when subtle variations in the echoes seemed to coincide with changes in atmospheric pressure, though inconsistently. Some mornings the sound appeared sharper, almost punctuated, while on others it was soft and continuous, vanishing and returning in irregular intervals. Greely speculated that there might be channels or cavities beneath the ice, acting as conduits for vibration, though he emphasized that no direct evidence could confirm this. The men became attuned to these fluctuations, noting even minor deviations in tone or intensity, aware that each anomaly was a clue they might never fully interpret. Apprehension tightened its grip on the men, their imagination stirred by the knowledge that these sounds arose from an unseen world far below the frozen surface. Some spoke of submerged channels, hidden caves, or ice layers moving silently under pressure, while others simply noted that nothing in prior expeditions had prepared them for auditory phenomena of this kind. Anxiety and fascination intertwined, as the men balanced rational hypotheses with the unnerving certainty that the Arctic could harbour forces beyond immediate comprehension. Even routine tasks, such as adjusting sledges or checking equipment, were performed with heightened awareness, as if the ice itself might react to human presence. Contemporary studies of ice acoustics suggested distant groaning and cracking were normal, yet Greely's accounts described a cadence and resonance unlike any previously recorded. The rhythmic pattern seemed almost deliberate, defying conventional explanation while aligning consistently with observations across multiple ice sheets. No machinery, no wind pattern, and no geological precedent fully accounted for the pulses, leaving the echoes lodged between empirical data and the unknown. Future explorers would reference Greely's meticulous records as some of the clearest documentation of Arctic acoustic phenomena, though the mystery remained intact. The echoes lingered as twilight fell, vibrating through the ice in patterns that resisted interpretation, leaving the men to reconcile their instruments with the inexplicable sounds. Each pulse seemed to pulse with the frozen world itself, a subterranean rhythm that challenged the notion of a stable, predictable Arctic environment. Darkness deepened, and the pulses persisted, seemingly indifferent to human presence, a quiet reminder that beneath the surface lay a realm untouched and unknowable, a hidden architecture of ice and sound that would endure long after the expedition departed. From somewhere deep below, the frozen world seemed to breathe in steady pulses, a hidden rhythm that human ears could trace but never fully comprehend. Kane's camp clock, losing an entire hour. The morning light seemed unusually extended, yet the men felt an odd compression of hours, as if time had quietly shifted around them. Kane's eyes first settled on the camp's main chronometer, its hands betraying a discrepancy that he could scarcely reconcile. For a moment, he suspected misreading, fatigue, or even the subtle influence of Arctic haze on perception, but a glance at his own pocket watch confirmed the unsettling truth. An entire hour had vanished. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the wind sweeping across the frozen landscape, carrying with it a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of unease. Kane noticed the first inconsistencies when his own chronometer conflicted with the camp's main clock, an impossible misalignment that stirred immediate scrutiny. Instruments were examined in tandem, each hand, gear and spring inspected for malfunction. Yet all appeared flawless, the mechanisms unharmed by cold or mishandling. The crew, accustomed to routine and precision, grew increasingly aware of the strangeness. Time, which they had relied on as a constant metric, now seemed mutable. Even minor activities, a sled adjustment, a meal, the distribution of rations, were suddenly subject to the uncertainty of lost hours. Despite the mechanical precision of each instrument, the passage of time felt unreliable, each minute slipping in ways the men could neither measure nor anticipate. Observers noted the odd sensation of events occurring too quickly or dragging interminably, a subtle distortion that no single device could capture. Logs from previous days were scrutinized in vain, revealing only the stark reality of the missing hour. This discrepancy was not gradual or cumulative. It had occurred instantaneously, a sudden absence that left a tangible void in the sequence of measured moments. Hesitation marked the crew, their uncertainty growing with every glance at watches that stubbornly refused to agree with one another. Whispers spread about the anomaly, mingling speculation with unease. Some feared a subtle error in record-keeping, others considered the more abstract possibility that the Arctic itself exerted influence over perception. Even those who prided themselves on rigorous observation admitted to a growing disorientation, a creeping doubt that the familiar metrics of time could no longer be trusted. The Arctic's relentless cold and the magnetic influences of high latitude were considered, yet no known force could account for the simultaneous loss of a full hour. Experiments were undertaken, chronometers were moved to different locations, shielded from drafts and insulated against frost, but each device continued to align with the impossible lapse. Kane meticulously noted temperature fluctuations, barometric readings, and the precise orientation of each instrument. The data yielded no explanatory pattern, leaving the anomaly lodged between empirical observation and something that resisted definition. Each recurrence was accompanied by subtle unease, a creeping sensation that the frozen landscape itself might bend hours to its own unknowable rhythm. The men became hyper-aware of their surroundings, noting the faint creaks of ice, the shifting light over snowfields, the sudden hush that could fall over the camp. Ordinary phenomena took on uncanny significance. A cracking ridge or a distant groan of ice became interwoven with the perception that time had slipped beyond their control. Even habitual tasks assumed a surreal quality, their normal cadence disrupted by the invisible hand of lost hours. Daily routines became erratic, with meals and duties arriving either too soon or belatedly, leaving the men caught between measured schedules and the capricious drift of perceived time. The synchronization of sled teams, essential for long Arctic travel, became fraught with minor confusion, though no disaster occurred. Conversations lagged or rushed unexpectedly, the subtle distortion infiltrating both labor and leisure. Each man carried the awareness of temporal instability as a quiet tension, a reminder that even the most mundane aspects of camp life were subject to forces they could neither see nor fully comprehend. Kane's journal became a careful chronicle not only of hours and minutes, but of the men's reactions, the frozen environment, and every attempt to rationalise the anomaly. His entries combined scientific rigour with observational insight, recording not only the instrument's readings but also the subjective impressions of those under his command. He measured, compared and cross-checked, yet the explanations remained elusive. Each note captured the strange duality of certainty and doubt. Instruments indicated one truth, perception suggested another, and the lost hour occupied the space in between. The fragility of human perception became evident as even seasoned explorers found that a lost hour could unsettle memory, expectation, and the sense of order. Conversations turned philosophical, subtle arguments emerging over whether time itself could behave differently under extreme Arctic conditions. The men grappled with the realization that schedules and measurements, the pillars of exploration and navigation, could not fully anchor them in the reality of the frozen expanse. The anomaly was not catastrophic, yet it left an indelible mark on consciousness, a quiet reminder that even carefully observed truth could falter. Though instruments were inspected and recalibrated, no explanation emerged, leaving the expedition to navigate a camp where time seemed to slip away unseen. Each morning the men awoke with an intuitive hesitation, uncertain whether the day had truly begun or whether the hours they counted had already been altered by some imperceptible force. The anomaly persisted as a subtle but persistent presence, shaping experience and expectation while eluding comprehension. No theory, no mechanical adjustment, and no environmental observation could fully reconcile the missing hour with the otherwise predictable mechanics of Arctic life. An hour vanished from their lives as if the Arctic itself had quietly rewritten the day, leaving a void no clock could ever measure. Nordenskiöld's stars that shifted position midnight. Nordenskiöld tightened his grip on the telescope as a familiar constellation appeared to drift inexplicably across the sky, an event no chart could anticipate. The stars that had guided sailors and explorers for centuries seemed to lose their steadfastness, sliding with imperceptible but undeniable motion. At first, he questioned his own perception, aware that fatigue and Arctic monotony could distort judgment, yet the precision of the movement, observed through magnified lenses and repeated scans, left little room for doubt. Even seasoned observers, accustomed to extreme conditions, exchanged glances, each realizing that the celestial framework itself seemed to be in flux. Immediate verification followed, with sextant readings and angular calculations revealing discrepancies that exceeded normal observational error. Nordenskiöld meticulously compared each measurement against his meticulously prepared charts, noting deviations of several degrees in stars that should have remained fixed. The instruments functioned flawlessly. The Arctic cold had not warped their calibration, nor had the sudden motion been caused by mechanical failure. Yet the readings persisted, stubbornly contradictory to centuries of established astronomical knowledge, leaving the expedition with a problem that was both precise and inexplicably disorienting. Instruments were adjusted and remeasured, yet each check confirmed that the celestial positions defied expected coordinates. The Vega's astronomer repeated calculations at multiple vantage points along the deck, observing identical anomalies from every perspective. He documented the discrepancies with meticulous care, recording times, angles, and apparent trajectories, creating a dataset that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Crew members began to whisper about the untrustworthy sky, noting that navigation, the one constant in the unpredictable Arctic, had suddenly become uncertain. Crew members leaned closer, murmuring at the subtle distortions in Ursa Major and Orion, as though the heavens had been quietly rearranged. The phenomenon was not violent or dramatic. It was a slow, deliberate shift, enough to challenge orientation but subtle enough to escape immediate recognition. Men accustomed to reading the stars with confidence found themselves hesitating, measuring twice and still feeling unease. The habitual trust in celestial patterns that had guided Arctic expeditions for decades now seemed tenuous, as though the sky were a living canvas, capable of alteration without explanation. Atmospheric refraction, polar mirages and unusual ice haze were considered, but the precision and consistency of the shifts rendered conventional explanations insufficient. Nordenskiöld consulted older records and charts, seeking historical precedent for such movements, but none existed. The Arctic night sky could distort perception, but never in a manner so systematic or repeatable. Each measurement returned to the same conclusion. The stars had shifted, and their motion obeyed no known law, leaving the observers in a suspended uncertainty that weighed heavily upon the expedition. Unceasing and puzzling, the same displacements persisted, a phenomenon that both intrigued and unsettled the men dependent on accurate celestial navigation. Observers took turns documenting the positions of constellations, finding that repeated calculations confirmed the anomalies. Some began to speculate quietly about unseen forces, optical, magnetic, or atmospheric, that could bend the heavens without warning. Others considered more abstract explanations, wondering if the Arctic held conditions that could distort even the immutable laws of astronomy. In every case, fascination mixed with unease, producing a quiet tension across the deck. Conversation turned cautious, with observers noting the tension that arose when the constellations they trusted became unpredictable guides. The men avoided speculative arguments, instead recording observations with strict attention to detail. The psychological weight of a shifting sky grew, amplified by the isolation and monotony of Arctic travel. Even basic tasks, like plotting the ship's position or estimating distance, required double-checking and cross-referencing. The stars, once a dependable tool, had become an enigmatic variable, introducing uncertainty into an environment already defined by risk and extreme conditions. Nordenskjöld's journal documented every observation, complete with sketches, timestamps, and angular measurements, forming a meticulous record of the anomaly. He noted the subtle deviations in individual stars, the relative motion of neighbouring constellations, and the apparent drift over the hours of observation. Each entry emphasised both precision and limitation. The data were accurate, but they described a phenomenon without explanation. By keeping rigorous notes, he hoped to provide future explorers and astronomers with evidence, a chance to understand something that, for the moment, defied all known principles. Each new calculation reinforced the impossibility, leaving the men to confront a sky that refused to conform to known laws of motion. Observers compared notes, charts, and sketches, realizing that the anomaly was consistent across instruments, time, and position. Even the Vega's most experienced astronomers could not account for the star's behavior. The Arctic sky, once predictable, had become mutable, bending expectation and challenging both knowledge and perception. The crew moved carefully through the hours, aware that the map of the heavens was no longer an absolute guide, but a riddle they had yet to solve. No instrument, chart, or repeated measurement could reconcile the star's altered positions with the established celestial framework, leaving the anomaly unresolved. Observers reluctantly acknowledged the limits of their understanding, documenting every detail while admitting that explanation remained out of reach. The constellation shifts persisted like a silent enigma, precise and undeniable, a reminder that the Arctic could conceal truths beyond human comprehension. Each night the stars appeared familiar yet impossible, a cosmic puzzle that demanded attention yet offered no answer. Above the Vega, constellations had shifted into patterns that resisted prediction, leaving the expedition beneath a sky that seemed to follow its own hidden logic.